And this is Mike Fader on Sirius XM Left 127. Tonight, we have a couple of authors on who have written books about the two really most important wars ever fought in the United States and by the United States. That's World War II and Gettysburg, a new book about Gettysburg, especially since this is the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, which was the turning point of the Civil War. So we're going to talk to the author of that book in just a little bit. And at the 6 o'clock hour, we're going to talk to Rick Atkinson, who wrote a book called The Guns at Last Light, which is the third in a trilogy of books he wrote on the U.S. involvement in World War II and generally about World War II. The emphasis on this show tonight will be on these battles, but also on the larger issue of patriotism, since it is, or was July 4th, Independence Day. And I have a lot to say about patriotism. So why don't we start off with our first author today, who's Alan C. Guelzo, and his new book is called Gettysburg, The Last Invasion. Hello.
How you doing, Mike?
Okay.
Very good.
Let me read some information about your background. Is that all right? And then we'll...
Yeah, so long as it's nothing that attracts my creditors or,
No, I don't give any personal information here.
Okay.
But there'll be a price.
All right.
Okay. All right. Alan C. Guelzo is the Henry R. Luce Professor of the Civil War Era and Director of Civil War Era Studies at Gettysburg College. And he's the author of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, The End of Slavery in America, and Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President. Both winners of the Lincoln Prize. Guelzo's essays, reviews, and articles have appeared in publications ranging from the American Historical Review and the Wilson Quarterly to newspapers such as the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Wall Street Journal. Here we are, what now? It's, I guess, 3 days after the last shots were fired, 150 years ago, roughly.
That's right.
Yeah, and it's hard to know where to start with something like this, but essentially you would call this, and I've read a lot of books like this is a military history, essentially, right?
Essentially, yeah. It's a military event, so it's a military history.
Now, I've read Shelby Foote's all the volumes.
Mm-hmm.
Would you call that a military history or what?
I'd say it's a real interesting story about the Civil War written by a very talented novelist.
Okay.
Which is true. I mean, that is what Shelby Foote was fundamentally. He was a novelist.
Uh-huh.
And he turned his hand to writing his 3-volume history of the Civil War. And it's a lovely, rollicking read. It really is.
And it's a great read. It's true.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, but it's still, he's not a military history person. He wasn't, because now it's past tense, what you would call a professional historian. But boy, could he tell a story? But
there was a tremendous focus on, because I've read all kinds of books about Lincoln and the Civil War, but there was a huge focus on battles and movements and troop movements.
Sure. And the funny thing is, Mike, that 50 years ago, at the time of the Civil War centennial, when there was a lot of history writing about the Civil War, a lot of books about battles, about campaigns and armies, the overwhelming majority of that was actually written by people who were not in academic positions, who were not what you'd call military historians.
Mm-hmm.
Bruce Catton, who's probably the most famous name of all, was a journalist. And Shelby Foote, as I say, was a novelist. Many of the others who were writing really good Civil War history at that time were not what we today would probably call professional historians. That didn't mean they weren't good at writing. Boy, they were. But I think it's interesting that over this period of time, the Civil War, as a war, has now moved more and more into the captivity of academe. And right now, the bulk of Civil War books that get published, books on Civil War themes, really are coming, surprisingly, from university presses.
Now, Michael Schara's book, the Killer Angels, which is, I think, the one that's the most famous in the modern era, is that also what you would call more of a novelistic approach?
Oh, it is clearly a novelist's approach. Schara was an English professor, and what he wrote in The Killer Angels was literally fiction. Now, it was extremely well-informed fiction. He'd read a lot. He'd been to the Gettysburg battlefield. And to go back and reread after 40-some years, The Killer Angels, as I've had to do, you're just struck by the incredible intensity that Schara was able to infuse the story of Gettysburg with. And, of course, he probably is more than anyone else responsible for the emergence of what I'll call the cult of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain at Little Round Top.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something we can discuss in a little while, because I suppose I'm a member of that cult, and you can disabuse me of my idolatry. So, after all, live and learn, right? So what distinguishes your book, then, Gettysburg, The Last Invasion, from these other books or kinds of books?
Well, let me start by saying that I am not, strictly speaking, a military historian.
Mm-hmm.
I don't teach military history. I don't do military history. My father was career Army. My son is a second lieutenant in armor. But I myself am not military, except in the sense that I was an Army brat. And I always used to say that if Army brats had a service ribbon anywhere, the colors would be black and blue.
Yeah, well, I've heard that story personally from some people I know, so I understand what you're talking about.
But I'm not a military history person per se. I wrote my dissertation at the University of Pennsylvania on 18th century moral philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And I've written about 19th century religion. I've written about Lincoln a good deal. This is really my first foray into what, strictly speaking, could be called military history.
Mm-hmm.
And I do it in a way that probably would violate some of the rules that military historians think should be carved in stone.
Like what, for instance?
Politics. I look a lot and spend a lot of time with the political assumptions that the generals in both armies brought to the battle, because both of these armies were, politically speaking, very divided houses. In the Army of Northern Virginia, tremendous amounts of political suspicion. In the Army of the Potomac, even greater amounts, because the Army of the Potomac was the child, the creation of George B. McClellan.
Mm-hmm.
McClellan never saw eye to eye with Abraham Lincoln about the conduct of the war. And McClellanites, and McClellan stocked the Army of the Potomac with his own favorites. McClellanites, even after McClellan was dismissed from command of the Army, still ran the Army of the Potomac as though they thought Lincoln and the radical Republicans were as much responsible for the Civil War as the secessionists.
So McClellan and his group, McClellan, for people who, a lot of people don't study history in America anymore, but McClellan was actually, intended to be president. He didn't want Lincoln to be president. He wanted to be president. Right?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, in 1864, he's the Democratic nominee for the presidency running against Lincoln.
And so he retained tremendous amount of power over this army that fought on the Union side at Gettysburg.
The Army adored him.
Mm-hmm.
The ordinary men in the ranks. When McClellan was dismissed from command, finally, by Lincoln in November of 1862, the soldiers gathered shouting, "General, lead us to Washington. We'll follow you." And even during the Gettysburg campaign, McClellan is keeping in touch with his former subordinates. After Gettysburg, one of the corps commanders in the Army of the Potomac, John Sedgwick, actually offers to take up a collection throughout the Army to put up a monument to George McClellan to express the Army's gratitude to him.
Now, so when you're talking about these houses divided, so in both cases you got houses divided on each side, what effect does it have? I mean, what were McClellan's politics that altered or affected how this army may have fought, especially at Gettysburg?
Well, it certainly affected a number of military decisions that are made during the battle.
Mm-hmm.
Take, for instance, what happens on July 2nd, the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. Commander of the Army of the Potomac is George Gordon Meade.
Right.
He is a McClellanite. He's not as raging and foaming at the mouth as some of the McClellanites were in terms of his loyalty to McClellan, but he was definitely a Democrat, knew the McClellan family because they were both Philadelphians from the same neighborhood, and was very sympathetic to the McClellanite point of view.
Which was?
That the war really should not be used as a gift to the radical Republicans. You work on the assumption, at least some people do in political circles, that no good crisis should go to waste.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the suspicion among McClellanite officers was if they won a tremendous resounding victory, all that would do would provide political justification and political capital to the radical Republicans.
Mm.
In the case of McClellan, it means he pulls his punches. He doesn't want the war to end in a resounding victory for Lincoln or the radical Republicans. What he wants is the war to be pushed along, to be drawn out, and finally to result in some kind of negotiated settlement between North and South that will not involve slavery.
So his feelings of pulling his punches, you're saying, actually affected George Meade, who was in charge of the Army, and he pulled his punches at Gettysburg.
Because Meade had no more love for Lincoln and the radical Republicans than McClellan did. And when you look at what happens at Gettysburg on the 2nd of July, here's my example. On the 2nd, George Meade posts the 3rd Corps of the Army of the Potomac, commanded by Daniel E. Sickles, way out on the far left flank of his position, way down on Cemetery Ridge, and then pretty much turns his back and forgets about Sickles. Why? Because Sickles is a war Democrat. He is a Democrat, but he has turned his coat and is avidly supporting Lincoln. Meade loathed Dan Sickles. So he posts Dan Sickles far out of what Meade supposes is any place where Sickles is going to have an opportunity to share in the fighting. And that's, in fact, exactly what Sickles suspects. That means that all through the morning of July 2nd, when there are huge Confederate forces massing in the woods opposite Sickles' position, and Sickles is sending warnings to Meade about this, Meade brushes them away. He says, generals, they always think an attack is going to come in front of their lines. So when the attack finally does come, it comes as a complete surprise to Meade, and it rolls right over and destroys the 3rd Corps of the Army of the Potomac.
But, I find this extraordinary. First of all, I don't want to get away from it. It's funny, we're talking about what happened in your book, but you're here to sell your book, too, right? The book is called Gettysburg, The Last Invasion, Alan C. Guelzo. It's spelled Guelzo. And, of course, you're talking about the book itself is a balance that you've struck, or I guess what I'd call you try to strike, between the politics and of the people at the highest levels or the higher levels and the actual soldiers' experience in the war. Is that a correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So
on the one hand, we tend to think that our generals, our military, should be apolitical. They should not be involved in politics, and they should take the direction of the civilian authorities and the civilian commanders.
Well, I hope so, yeah.
That's supposed to be what we take as given. Now, there have been some moments when that seems to have been a little dicey, as in MacArthur's relationship with Truman.
Right.
But by and large, that's what we assume the rules of the game are. Well, Mike, those rules were not necessarily set fast as early as 1863. And the behavior of someone like McClellan or Meade, ignoring the directions of the commander-in-chief, behaving in a way that is somewhat less than enthusiastic about the conduct of the war and the conduct of the battle, that is not entirely surprising at that point. What is interesting is to take the attention off the generals and look carefully at what's happening among the ordinary soldiers. There you get a very, very different picture. The ordinary soldiers of the Army of the Potomac really understood that what they were marching into at Gettysburg was a real do-or-die moment. I mean, it was fourth down, and they were either going to win a victory on Northern soil, or else the Army of the Potomac was going to fall apart, and the Confederate Army was going to be able to dictate terms to the Lincoln administration.
Maybe you could explain that a little bit more fully, because I think a lot of people who aren't familiar with this battle, the most significant battle in American history, really, they don't understand how close the Confederate Army was to the actual capital of the United States and why they could dictate terms if they won this battle.
When you're at Gettysburg, you're only about 70 miles northwest of Washington, D.C., and what was the circle of fortifications that protected Washington during the Civil War. That means you're really not all that far away. You might be as many as 3 days' march, good, hardy marching, but still only 3 days away. It means you can also threaten Baltimore, and you can threaten Philadelphia, or if you wanted to turn westward, you could threaten Pittsburgh or Wheeling, or even, as one Confederate general suggested in 1862, keep moving north and plant the flag at Erie, Pennsylvania. And Lee had brought with him a battle-hardened veteran army that was confident of themselves, confident of the direction of Robert E. Lee, because Lee had beaten the Federal Army so many times in the previous year, that their reckoning was that when they moved up into Pennsylvania, the victory they would win there would finally convince Northerners, especially war-weary Northerners, that it was time to cash in and let's make an end to the Civil War and go to some kind of truce, armistice, and negotiation.
And after all, this is, I mean, if you go deep into the roots of all the political divisions up north, and people have written about this plenty of times before. I mean, you get things like the draft riots in New York City,
which take place 10 days after the close of the Battle of Gettysburg.
That's why I'm mentioning it. I mean, these things have a tremendous concurrence of, of politics. But
and bear in mind, too, there's not just draft riots in New York City. Those are the most famous. There's draft riots in Boston. Mm-hmm. There's draft riots in Toledo. There's draft riots in a number of major cities across the North. If Lee's army had been victorious at Gettysburg on the 3rd of July, 1863, then when the New York draft riots break out on the 14th of July, 1863, what do you suppose might have been the result coming downstream from that? I can almost imagine that instead of the Army of the Potomac suppressing the New York City draft riots, as it did, in fact, I can imagine instead the Army of Northern Virginia being called in to restore civil order to New York City.
Yeah, well, obviously, what's interesting to me here is you mentioned that the soldiers knew it was due, or that the ones on the ground knew it was due. We're talking about the, let's say, either the enlisted men or the drafted men, and then, let's say, ranks right up into, major or even, colonel or general or whatever. But they knew. You're not saying that the generals didn't know.
No, but they had a lot more in the way of politics entering into their decision-making. Okay. And it may not be simple. I mean, we tend to categorize things. One moment you're thinking politically, the other moment you're thinking militarily, as though it was two parallel railroad tracks. Mm-hmm. That's not really the way human beings think. We tend to think on one track that has a lot of freight on it. Mm-hmm. So someone can be conscious that they're making a military decision, and yet at the same time, at the back of their mind, there are political considerations which are amending and affecting that. Mm-hmm. And that is what you see over and over again in these armies.
I see the contrast with Mr. Atkinson's book, The Guns at Last Light. I mean, you see clearly the same kinds of things. I mean, the experiences of the soldiers on the line.
Oh, yes.
And civilians. As you also, you have experiences of civilians in your book, right?
A great many of them in Gettysburg, many of whom sought refuge in their cellars. Large number, of course, beat it out of town altogether, right. Including, and this is an interesting detail, including Gettysburg's black population. And the reason they left en masse was not because they were afraid of Confederates coming in and stealing things and whatnot. They were afraid of Confederates coming in and kidnapping them and selling them into slavery back in Virginia.
Well, they had every right to have that. Yeah.
Sure. And in fact, as many as 500 black people in central Pennsylvania were, in fact, rounded up by Confederate forces and marched off down to Richmond to be sold in the slave markets there.
Well, speaking of which, you mentioned in your book that the Confederate Army had thousands of black slaves serving them in the course of this?
We often ask the question, because we look at the official numbers of the armies and we say, wait a minute, Lee is going on the offensive with 85,000 men, right, more or less, whereas General Meade and the Union Army have got 95,000. I mean, who in their right mind attacks someone with superior forces? Except that there is this invisible reinforcement that Lee has, and that is anywhere from 10 to 30,000 black slaves who accompany the Army of Northern Virginia and perform all of the logistical tasks that in the Army of the Potomac have to be performed by enlisted personnel or by civilian contractors. When you add in that extra bonus of 10 to 30,000 and then subtract from the federal numbers the number of soldiers who had to be detailed to these other functions, then all of a sudden it begins to look a good deal more lopsided in favor of the Confederate Army.
It's an interesting detail because it involves supply, transport, all kinds of things, cooking food, everything you can possibly imagine. As you say, those soldiers didn't have to do that on the other side, so they had an advantage.
Well, in a way, it underscores that when the Confederate Army moves up into Pennsylvania, this is, at the end of the day, no matter what other rationalizations are used to explain the Confederacy, secession, or whatever, at the end of the day, this is an army which is fighting on behalf of slavery. And they are carrying the evidence of that with them in this invisible core of black slaves who are compelled, against their wills, but compelled to act as the logistical underpinnings for the white fighting soldiers.
giving some people in the North a very good reason to point out right there and then why they were fighting, right?
Absolutely. In fact, it was exactly this. One historian named Glenn Brashear last year published a really wonderful book on emancipation and the Peninsula Campaign of 1862. Mm-hmm. And what he pointed out was that all the reports that were coming back to northern newspapers about these slaves who were being used in logistical roles, this became actually an argument in favor of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, with the feeling that if you emancipate these slaves, they're not going to stay there, they're going to run away, and that'll deprive the Confederacy of its logistical props. Mm-hmm. Well, the same thing actually is true here. People look at this enormous core of black slaves, and they say, this is what we're really fighting this about. These black slaves, slavery itself, is being deployed in this battle to destroy the Union. Therefore, in order to preserve the Union, we need to strike back at slavery.
So this battle, one of the things you say in here is that often when you watch sports events, this is like inevitable, so I apologize for that. The comparison of sports events and sports terms along with the military. However,
I do it myself.
Okay, having said that, then all right. So, but you're saying often you say in sports, you say your team didn't so much lose the game. The other team didn't win so much as your team lost. You are saying in your book here that General Meade and the way he ran that battle, it was Lee's battle basically to win, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Can you explain?
Meade's, if you look carefully at George Meade's command style, say this in defense of George Meade, he's only shoved into command of the Army of the Potomac unwillingly and 3 days before the battle begins. He's got no time to create a staff of his own. He's not even entirely sure where all the parts of his army are. Mm-hmm. So the fact that he's struggling against that situation, you have to cut him some slack. Yet, at the same time, when he engages the enemy at Gettysburg, for one thing, he's not there on the first day of the battle. He doesn't reach Gettysburg until the wee hours of July 2nd. And from that point on, he really misguesses every move that Lee makes, including Pickett's charge, and his command behavior is almost entirely reactive. He's responding to what Lee and the Confederates are doing more than taking the initiative on his own. So he's playing almost a strictly defensive game rather than trying to lash back at the Confederates and put them off their balance.
I've read a lot of military history, and, what's even more fascinating to me, and I've interviewed a lot of people too, and I've interviewed a lot of biographers, people who've devoted years, if not their whole lives, to the biographies of various people. More particularly, I've interviewed a lot of British people who are biographers of German generals and Nazi leaders. Mm-hmm. And you know more about this probably than I do, than I'd ever do, being closer to the whole idea of being a historian. Sometimes biographers and people who get involved in these things get lost in their own subjects. And you wonder sometimes where it is their morality or their passion lies. Do you know what I'm driving at?
I know exactly. All because if you're going to devote the kind of time that you did writing a book, doing the research, digging down through the papers, visiting the archives, you don't want to come at the end of that and say, this guy was a real schnook. What was I thinking when I started this? That's kind of self.
Right, so you wasted your life.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So almost as a compensatory gesture, people will start say, well, this terrible person, but it wasn't quite so terrible in this way, or he didn't make these kinds of mistakes, or maybe he made the others, but it wasn't the critic. And it goes on and on like that. That's, unfortunately, a very natural temptation.
Well, what's connected to this, and the point I mean to make here, is that sometimes somebody in a position, you write about this battle here in great detail, and you write about the strategies and the soldiers on the ground and the tremendous sights and smells and fears and sounds of actual battle, and you're writing about the strategy too in the politics. Do you tend to lose while you're doing this, while you're writing it, if you had to begin with, which I assume you did, a point of view about how this battle should have turned out and why people were fighting this? Do you see what I'm saying?
Only in the most general sense. The specific things, touching on people like George Meade, for instance, I had to do a 180 degree on. When I started the whole project, I really had the attitude that George Meade had been unfairly treated. Here the man gets this army put into his lap with no warning, thrust into a major 3-day battle with the most formidable army the Confederacy can put in front of him. And then, after a 3-day bloodletting, he's expected to chase after them as fast as a jackrabbit and bring them down.
Which he did not do,
Which he did not do.
Right.
So you look at that and you think, the politicians were sticking their nose a little too deeply into this and expecting just entirely too much. But the more I read Meade's papers, in the Meade family papers at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the more a very different George Meade tended to emerge. Historians who have relied on, for instance, the 2-volume Life and Letters of George Meade, which were assembled by his son, George Jr., or have used biographies of Meade like Freeman Cleaves's biography of Meade, will get what they think is a very straightforward story of a purely professional soldier who was just interested in the facts. What they don't realize is that the documents that Meade Jr. included in his Life and Letters were very carefully bowdlerized. There were a lot of letters that never made it into that collection, and some letters that did make it into the collection had some of the nasty parts vacuumed out. In other words, George Meade was really trying to present as possible, as positive a view of his father as possible.
So that he was not a conservative, maybe lackluster general.
No. Instead, he's the noble victor of Gettysburg.
I see. But he was no George Patton.
Right. And when people read the Life and Letters of Meade, which was published in 1913, they don't realize that, in a sense, they're being slipped a Mickey, because there's lots of stuff in those letters that they think that's all there is, and that is not the case. Reading the letters in the manuscript collections gave me a whole different understanding of George Meade, a very politicized general, very hostile to Lincoln, friendly to McClellan, and above all, here, I'll give you an example, because this, I think, more than any other item in the Meade papers really shocked me. In January, the end of January 1865, George Meade is at Army headquarters during the siege of Petersburg. Through the lines come the 3 Confederate commissioners who are bound for a meeting, last-ditch, last-minute peace negotiation with Lincoln at Hampton Roads. This is what we saw in the Lincoln movie. Meade meets them at Army headquarters and strikes up a conversation, starts chatting them up, and in very short measure, he begins giving them talking points to use in the negotiations. He tells them, well, these are the conditions on which the people of the North would be agreeable to peace. Oh, and as for slavery, don't worry about that. We have to get rid of slavery, but we will work out some quid pro quo with all of you white Confederates so that you can still oppress and exploit the labor of black people. We just won't call it slavery.
Well, so much for the people having precedence over their army.
Yeah, I mean, I read that and I thought, my goodness, whose side are you on? This is a major general of the United States Army in titular command of the Army of the Potomac. It's no wonder that at the very bottom of the letter, which was written to his wife, Meade writes, make sure you never let anyone see this, as the consequences could be serious. I'm thinking, oh, amen to that.
So let me get back to the book and to the battle here. As opposed, generally speaking, to a lot of modern, we have this technological army now, to put it mildly. But you say a lot of accidents and failure of communications dictated a lot of what happened at Gettysburg, right?
Oh, absolutely, because the communications technology of the 19th century, especially on the field of battle, hasn't really improved materially since the days of Julius Caesar. You communicate orders on a battlefield basically by 3 means: by drum, by bugle, and by voice. And if in the racket of battle that communication goes awry, that's just too bad for the people who were supposed to get those orders. And then when you add into it, I mean, there's no walkie-talkies, there's no field telephones. If an order is being given at, let's say, corps level command, a corps headquarters, well, that order has got to go down through division, then down through brigade, then down to the regiment where they're actually on the firing line. That's a process in the 19th century that can take up to 45 minutes. And then suppose the regimental commander who receives that order doesn't understand it and wants a clarification.
Or something could have shifted dramatically in the battle by that point.
That is why battle in the 19th century, and especially at Gettysburg, if we had to observe it, would strike us as being very slow-moving, like a very over-choreographed ballet. Things do not happen quickly, and they happen in slow-moving masses and clumps of men. It does not look like the movies. I mean, it certainly doesn't look like the kind of infantry combat that Rick Atkinson has described in his books about the United States Army in the Second World War. The armies of the Civil War, the battles of the Civil War, hark back much more to the 18th century, to the Napoleonic Wars, than they do to anything that looks forward to, let's say, the 1914-1918 war.
So would you say that the triumph of the Union forces at Gettysburg was attributable to accidents and luck?
In large measure, yes. And I think that's true because so many of the really key moments in the battle.
For instance, give a couple of specifics, will you? Yeah.
Well, so, for instance, Little Round Top, or the charge of the 1st Minnesota, or Pappy Green on Culp's Hill, or Samuel Sprigg Carroll on East Cemetery Hill. These were the results of individual initiatives at lower levels, not coming down from the generals in total command of the Army at the very top of the heap. It's people obeying their own common sense instinct about what to do and doing it without a lot of direction. And in the case of the Army of the Potomac, doing it over and over again and somehow getting it right each time they do it.
Well, in that case, then you might say there was a reflection on the other side where a lot of miscommunications and accidents went wrong, worse on the other side.
That is the great cloying mistake of the Confederate Army at Gettysburg, and that is nobody's taking the initiative. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Confederate Army was now operating on very different territory than it had been operating before. When they were in Virginia, it was a different story. But you move up to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania looks different. It is different. And increasingly, you have the sense of these Confederate generals always looking over their shoulders, waiting for someone to give them direction about what to do.
Was that because of the structure of the Army was based on Lee being all important?
Actually, Lee had a very hands-off management style.
Oh, he did.
He explained his style as being something like this. His job was to get the parts of the Army to the battlefield together, and thereafter he would turn the management of the fighting over to his lieutenant generals.
Well, it had worked before.
It had worked like a charm when Stonewall Jackson and James Longstreet were his only two lieutenant generals. Now at Gettysburg, Stonewall Jackson's been dead for 2 months. Now he has two new Corps commanders in place, Dick Ewell and Powell Hill. And these people, they're new in command. They're untested. And you really do get this sense that they were hesitant to make decisions on their own, which is a great frustration to Lee because that was what he expected them to do. So Lee at Gettysburg has to do something he doesn't like doing, and that is he has time and again to step in and micromanage what his lieutenant generals are doing.
Is it something you say he didn't like doing it? Was it something he was just not good at it too?
I don't know if it was a case where he was not good at it, but it simply wasn't what he thought was an appropriate thing for him to do as the commander.
Now, people may know this, but they may not, but Lee was considered by Lincoln to be a competent enough general, an important enough general, that Lincoln offered him one of the highest positions, right?
Right at the beginning of the war, Lincoln, Winfield Scott, who was then General-in-Chief of the Army, offered Lee complete command of the Union forces. Lee turns it down, goes south. Lee always had and cultivated the attitude of a Virginia Tidewater aristocrat. That's part of why he doesn't like to micromanage. He prefers to stand aloof and give orders at a distance. But it's also, I think, a certain measure of practicality, because on these Civil War battlefields, you really couldn't micromanage with any kind of effectiveness, or else you were liable to make the worst possible kinds of decisions. So Lee was not doing something that was irrational or selfish. To the contrary, he actually had a very good view of what a general's relationship to his subordinates ought to be in a 19th century battle. It's that his subordinates were not behaving according to that script. They were wanting him to come down and basically tie their bibs and put their forks and spoons in their hand and tell them what to do.
You know, I am, like most other people, a great consumer of various levels of mass culture, one of which refers back to a remark you made at the beginning of this conversation. By the way, if you just tuned in, We are speaking to Alan C. Guelzo, who has a brand new book out called Gettysburg, The Last Invasion, with an astounding array of photographs in here, too, of the war. Basically a book which combines discussions of the political rifts between generals who fought the war and politics, and also the experiences of the soldiers who fought the war, And I guess you read a whole lot of, to put it mildly, a whole lot of information from the average soldier afterwards, right? I mean, all these years.
When these soldiers, at the end of the fighting on July 3rd, when these soldiers sat down to think about what had happened to them, they realized they had been through an epical event. And they immediately began writing letters home, describing it. They begin writing newspaper columns for their hometown newspapers. And over the years that follow, they write books, they write lectures. The amount of material written by the soldiers who were participants at Gettysburg is simply phenomenal. And I think that's because, for one thing, American society in the middle of the 19th century is a hyper-literate society. More than any other nation on the face of the earth, you have tremendously high rates of reading and writing that everybody participates in. So they had no trouble writing down their recollections, and they certainly didn't lack for audiences that were interested in reading them.
David Brooks of the New York Times did a column which is based mostly on your book, which I'm sure you've read, right?
Yes.
And he mentioned something in there that's absolutely fascinating, which is the amount of discussion by the average soldier in the Civil War, and I'm presuming on both sides, when they wrote letters home and wrote articles and things like this about what the war was about. In other words, the morality or the greater issues involved as compared to soldiers, let's say, in World War II. First of all, is that true? And if so, why?
Yes, it is. I mean, for soldiers in World War II, the alternatives were fairly clear-cut. There were few United States soldiers in World War II who had any particular kind of affection for Adolf Hitler or for General Tojo. Whereas in the American armies, they were really dealing with very high-level moral, political issues, and they wrote a lot about them. They wrote about slavery. They wrote about the public policy measures of the Lincoln administration or of the Jefferson Davis administration. And, one of the great accomplishments of the Civil War, but one which hardly ever gets any kind of heraldry, is the mail services of both armies. The post office departments of both the Union and the Confederacy functioned right up until the end of the war, even for the Confederacy, with enormous, just breathtaking efficiency in moving letters over large stretches of contested territory. And we don't often think of that as being important, but it is for the morale of the soldiers in these armies. That is an accomplishment of extraordinary importance in the Civil War era, but because it's so mundane, we never really think to point it out.
So letters came from the other direction? In other words, letters came from home to the soldiers?
All the time. All the time. Again, this comes back to living in a society where 90% or plus 90% of the people could read and write. Sometimes they are simply writing home about local gossip in the army, and sometimes at home they're writing about local gossip in the hometowns. Other times they're debating politics. Sometimes the soldiers are writing, as one soldier did in the 11th Pennsylvania, right at the end of the battle. What do you think of your old Army of the Potomac now? One division commander in the Army of the Potomac, John White Geary, wrote to his wife just after the end of the Battle of Gettysburg, "I believe this is the beginning of the end. I believe this triumph is the turning point of the war." That was how he saw it. This is what he writes home to his wife. By the same token, Confederate soldiers write home to their families, and they're expressing the most extraordinary depression over what Gettysburg has inflicted on them. And they say the entire army is brokenhearted. They say that this is the worst blow the Confederacy has sustained since the fall of New Orleans in 1862. They're very straightforward and very forthright in expressing their disenchantment with what has happened to the Confederate cause.
Let me ask you this question. In the beginning of the conversation, you talked about Joshua Chamberlain. Now, Joshua Chamberlain, there's very few people. The word hero is thrown around sort of like a used napkin in American society, right?
Yes.
It's used every minute for everything. I mean, there are rock stars who are called heroes.
Right.
But I'm very very careful about who I think of or would describe as a hero.
And what you.
Now, okay. And one of them has always been Joshua Chamberlain, who people, if they've ever seen the movie Gettysburg, and I'm using these cultural references because they're something that everybody consumes. Mm-hmm. And I love that production, right? Just for other reasons, dramatic, the writing, the filming, everything. But based on the Killer Angels, and people have read the Killer Angels if they're interested in this. And Chamberlain is one of, if not the greatest hero in the book. He's the colonel, I believe he was a lieutenant colonel or a colonel, on Little Round Top, which was one of the crucial battle points of the battle. And they make him into a tremendous hero, and I always took him for one. So earlier, when you referred to that something as the mythology of the heroism of Chamberlain or whatever, maybe you could explain that, since now you've deflated my entire. Go ahead. Now you respond.
Well, I don't want to deflate it too much, because in truth, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain really did a heroic deed at Little Round Top.
So maybe you could set it up a little bit and tell us who he was.
He was Lieutenant Colonel of the 20th Maine Volunteers, one of 4 regiments in a brigade commanded by Strong Vincent, a lawyer from Erie, Pennsylvania. Strong Vincent takes his brigade, and he does this. Here's another example of people making decisions on their own. Vincent does this because he intercepts an order that was going up and down the chain of command about moving troops onto Little Round Top. He looks at the order and says, on my own authority, I'm going to take my brigade up there, which he does.
This was on one flank, right?
This is on the south side of Little Round Top.
And where was this in the battle, so people understand how important?
All the way at the far left flank of the Union Army.
Okay.
In other words, if you started at the right of the Union Army and went all the way around to the last man on the left, he'd be in the 20th Maine.
Okay.
Chamberlain is part of that brigade. And it's not that Chamberlain runs up onto Little Round Top himself. Strong Vincent is the one who gives the order to take that brigade up there. Mm-hmm. And it's Strong Vincent who gives the order, we have to hold this hill at all costs. Because
otherwise, the Confederate Army could get around the back of the Union.
Yeah. That's Strong Vincent's apprehension.
Okay.
So the first thing we have to say is that Joshua Chamberlain did not unilaterally, on his own, decide to defend Little Round Top. That was the decision made by his brigade commander, Strong Vincent, who was mortally wounded on Little Round Top and dies several days later. On the other hand, Chamberlain does do good things. For one thing, when his troops have finally shot off their ammunition and they're looking at each other and thinking, what do we do next? His instinct, and it's entirely, perfectly right on the money. Mm-hmm. He says, let's fix bayonets and charge down at them. They won't be expecting this. This will take them completely by surprise and will scatter them. The regiment fixes bayonets. One half of the regiment that had been bent back by Confederate pressure, almost at a 45-degree angle, he swings it out like a barn door, and they go yipping and yelling down the slope of Little Round Top. They hit the Alabamians who had been attacking them and drive them off.
Which was, according to what I've read and seen, and more precisely read since its history, that was almost the last straw for a group of people who had been charging uphill for
That's right.
an endless number of attacks. And if they had succeeded in getting around behind that extreme flank, it could have been a whole different battle, right?
Well, this is where we start to descend into the qualifications.
Okay, all right.
First qualification, was Little Round Top really all that strategically significant? Answer, no. Mm-hmm. If Little Round Top had fallen into Confederate hands, there really wasn't much they could do with it. It's a very rocky, spiny hill. And mostly what Strong Vincent does by establishing his brigade on that hill is to distract the Alabamians from doing the damage they could have done at another point in the Union line. So it's not that Little Round Top is really all that key. If it had fallen, it's not likely that the Confederates could really have held on to it for very much longer.
But it makes for good drama, right?
Oh, does it ever?
Okay.
But here's the other thing, too.
Yeah.
Joshua Chamberlain's not the only one on Little Round Top doing the beau geste, because at another point, up the north side of Little Round Top comes Patrick O'Rourke, colonel of the 140th New York. He gets to the top of Little Round Top at the north face just in time to fend off an attack by 2 Texas regiments. Mm-hmm. Now, he goes down, killed outright at that moment. But his decision to bring his unit up there was just as spontaneously generated as Chamberlain's decision to charge down with bayonets. So it's not that Chamberlain is not a hero. It's that he's one of a number of such heroes who saved the day on July 2nd. And that includes Patrick O'Rourke, Governor Warren, Strong Vincent, the men of the 1st Minnesota, the brigade under the command of Samuel Sprague Carroll, Old Pappy Green's brigade on Culp's Hill. These are people who make these snap decisions, just like Chamberlain did.
You know, it's useful to have heroes. Sometimes it's useful not for good reasons, but it's useful for good and bad reasons. Often for leaders of wars and of countries to have heroes, for people to follow along and to have passion for the cause. Mm-hmm. Is there any really, now I'm saying, I'm putting a pejorative here, but is there any really useful reason to have a hero? In a case like this, I mean, is it a bad thing that people think of him as a hero?
I don't think it is. Mm-hmm. I think having a hero is a very good thing. Because to have a hero is to lay out the patterns and principles of life that you believe are important, and not just to see them as abstractions, but to see them as something that's incorporated into the real flesh and blood of another human being. That means that, all right, that human being was a hero. Well, they didn't get that way because they were Superman. They were just like you. Mm-hmm. And that means that if you embrace those same principles, you too can live a heroic life. And given the circumstances, maybe it will come your turn to do as they did. I think having a hero is an ennobling thing. I think it lifts people up out of the ordinary. And perhaps it does another thing too, and that is it gives people a circle around which to rally in times of stress. Mm-hmm. Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago made a comment at one point that one of the first things the Soviets did when they came in and bulldozed a particular people was to take away their history, rewrite their history.
Right.
Because their history is the thing which gives them a point of comparison between the present and the past. If you can't compare the present to the past, then you've got no way to complain or feel unruffled or feel unsettled about the present. Take away their history, and you help to make oppressed people docile. To have heroes, however, gives you that circle around which to rally and to resist the imposition of tyrants and dictators and kings and other tin pot wannabes. Oh. I think on both of those points, having heroes, I think it's a laudable thing.
Well, I think that's brilliantly put. It also anticipates, obviously, my final question, which you've heard before, is why should people be interested in this history?
Well, at Gettysburg, one of the things I've tried to lay out in Gettysburg, The Last Invasion, is how often and at how many different points ordinary people stepped out of themselves, took charge, turned a dime, made the right decision, and saved the Union. This was not a battle about great generals. This was not some set piece where the generals were playing a kind of military chess. This was a struggle between armies that were, after all, amateurs, that could be, at one moment, killing each other, and the next moment, sharing a canteen of water. On the second day of the battle, after the firing had stopped, after darkness had fallen, one Confederate officer heard a voice warbling out over top of all the carnage that had taken place that day, singing, "Come, ye disconsolate, where'er ye may be," singing a hymn. And that voice went on to another hymn and another. And at the end, when he stopped, applause and cheers went up from both sides in the dark. Now, these were really remarkably ordinary, but extraordinarily remarkable people, all at the same time. I think it says a lot about Americans. I think it says a lot about American soldiers. And I think it provides us with an insight into ourselves that can do nothing but promote our own health, our own spiritual building and well-being as Americans.
An excellent reason to read this history or any history, but particularly Gettysburg, The Last Invasion. Excuse me, Alan C. Guelzo. It's Guelzo. obviously. In this technological age, everywhere online and available in bookstores. And it's a very good book. Also, the illustrations are tremendous. So I appreciate you coming on, and I do appreciate very much your explanation of why history matters, because it's something I'm always pounding away about here, and I think you put it perfectly. Thank you.
Let the pounding continue, Mike.
All right, thanks a lot.
Okay.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, it's important to read about what happened in your country's past, especially when it is sharpened like a sharp end of a stick or a knife in moments like these tremendous battles. This Civil War was one of the great turning points, if not the great turning point of American domestic history. And this battle was the turning point of the Civil War. So not to know about this battle, you don't have to know about every last person who got shot every single time. You don't have to know about every horse that jumped over every fence, although it is in this book. And one of the criticisms of the book from other historians and from a few critics has been that there's too much detail. I don't think there could ever be too much detail, but that all depends on how you want the book to sound. This book that we referred to earlier, called The Killer Angels, is the most famous American book about the Civil War, The Killer Angels. And from that, they made, I think it was a made-for-TV movie, which is something like 5 or 6 hours long, called Gettysburg. Oh, we never took a break? All right, we got to take a break. Are we too late for the break? Let's give it a shot. Okay. This is Mike Fader, Sirius XM Left 127. We have with us Rick Atkinson, who is the author of The Guns at Last Light, The War in Western Europe, 1944 to 1945. This is the third volume of something called the Liberation Trilogy, the third volume of a history of World War II, particularly from an American point of view, but a third volume. So we're talking about a couple of thousand pages here. Let me introduce Mr. Atkinson, and then we can begin discussing this book. Rick Atkinson is the best-selling author of An Army at Dawn, which is the first volume of the trilogy, which won the Pulitzer Prize. The Day of Battle, The Long Gray Line, In the Company of Soldiers, and Crusade. His many other awards include the Pulitzer Prize for Journalism, the George Polk Award, and the Pritzker Military Library Literature Award. He is a former staff writer and senior editor at the Washington Post and lives in Washington, D.C. We just got through talking in the previous hour to Alan Guelzo with his history of the Battle of Gettysburg. And what I'm interested in is people who seem to devote their entire lives almost, or are so fascinated by the military and military history. What brought you so completely to all of this?
Well, I think in my case, in part, it's my personal heritage. I'm an Army brat. My father enlisted in the Army in 1943 and came back from Europe in 1946, went to college and then went back into the Army and made a career of it. So I grew up on Army posts. He was an infantry officer. And then as a journalist, I covered various conflicts of one sort or another. So I think I come by it both personally and professionally myself.
It's interesting. Mr. Guelzo also grew up as a military brat, as he puts it. So it's a similar background.
It's contagious.
The Guns at Last Light covers the period from around D-Day, or obviously before, because we look at the preparations, but it covers from D-Day to the end of the war in Europe, right?
That's right. It opens on May 15th, 1944. It actually opens at St. Paul's School in London, where Eisenhower, George Patton, Omar Bradley, Bernard Montgomery, King George VI, Winston Churchill, all have gathered for a final review of the plan called Overlord. And this is the invasion of France that's then planned for June 5th, 1944. And they spend the whole day going over this very secret plan. And so the book opens there and describes the final couple weeks of preparations for the crossing of the English Channel. And then we follow the troops through D-Day and the battle beyond in Normandy, on across Europe through the liberation of Paris in late August of 44, the Battle of the Bulge in December and January of 44-45, and on through VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, which is May 8th, 1945.
The second volume in the trilogy was the battle in Sicily and Italy?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And the first was North Africa, right?
That's right, because that's really where the liberation of Europe begins. It doesn't begin in Europe for the Americans. It begins in North Africa with the invasion of Morocco and Algeria by British and American troops in November 1942, and then the subsequent 7-month campaign across the lip of North Africa to defeat the Germans and the Italians in Tunisia. And then after that happens, in the middle of May 1943, the campaign moves north to Sicily. We invaded again with the British on July 10th, 1943. That campaign lasts about 6 weeks, and then we move into southern Italy across the Strait of Messina. The main landings are at Salerno. Mm-hmm. And so the campaign, as I tell it, continues through the liberation of Rome, which is June 4th, 1944. It's just 2 days before the invasion of France.
Now, the buildup, they actually, when I keep referring back to this, and I won't do it too much anymore, but Mr. Guelzo in his history of the Civil War focused on two things. One was the politics and the strategizing and the arguing or the agreements at the top level, and then the soldiers' experiences in combat at the bottom level. Your book, I think, has more to it than that, but those are two basic elements involved, right?
Yeah, I in this book and in previous books, in fact, all of the military history narratives that I've written, I move from on high, where you have strategic and operational views of what's happening, including the highest levels. We see Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. We see them at Yalta, among other places, down to the foxhole tactical view of an infantry private or a tank crew. And I move back and forth between those various levels throughout the book, because I think that really is necessary in order to understand not only why they're doing what they're doing and what they're doing, but to get a sense of what it smells like, what it tastes like, what it sounds like. Mm-hmm. It's such an assault on the senses, and I try to certainly capture that in the way I write.
The build, you talk about the buildup of the American army, and especially its personnel in England, which was a subject for tremendous controversy and dis-ease for a lot of the Britons, right?
Well, of course, Britain is the size of the state of Oregon, and we managed to wedge a couple million GIs into this relatively small space, and there are plenty of others also staging for the big invasion of Europe, not just British and Americans, but Canadians and Poles and a variety of other nationalities. So, to say the least, it's an enormous imposition on the English, as well as those in Northern Ireland and Scotland. But they take it in good grace. They're absolutely critical to our ability to stage. The island of Britain essentially acts as a giant aircraft carrier because, among other things, we have many thousands of airplanes flying from there. Mm-hmm. So the process of preparing for D-Day, Operation Overlord, has been going on really since 1942, but it intensifies in the winter of 44-45, and then, of course, really hits a fever pitch in April and May of 1944.
But there was, and you write about this in the book very well, there was this culture clash, obviously, I mean, between the American culture and the British culture. Also, the Americans were fairly well supplied with things that the British had been doing without. They got paid more, that kind of thing, right?
Oh, it's absolutely true. The Brits believe the Americans can be really boorish, and they can. There are episodes where the Americans kill the swans, for example. One of the King's game reserves roast the swans. There are a number of episodes like that. There are so many little Anglo-Americans born to American servicemen impregnating English girls, that a treaty is invoked, and the English laws of bastardy are put into effect. And yes, the Americans have more of everything, really. And an enlisted man in the American Army is making more than a junior officer in the British Army. And that causes resentment. And there are culture clashes, and there are frictions, and they are two peoples divided by a common language. So all of these things are part of the tension leading up to June 6, 1944.
And the person pulling all this together at the combat level, if not the political, but at the combat level, is Eisenhower, who seems to me to come off pretty well in this book.
Yeah, I've been living with him now for the better part of 15 years, from the beginning of the first volume in the Liberation Trilogy, when he appears as the theater commander in the Mediterranean, having never heard a shot fired in anger. And by this time, by the spring of 1944, he's got quite a lot of experience under his belt of running a colossal military enterprise. I find that a couple of things. First of all, he's not a particularly good field marshal. He's not an especially good battle commander. It's not he doesn't have the natural gifts of a battle captain to see the field spatially and temporally the way great captains do, like Napoleon. But that's not really his job. It is indeed, as you say, to pull all this together. He describes himself as chairman of the board. That's precisely the right metaphor. He is the chairman of the largest martial enterprise on earth. And his main task is to hold together this fractious international coalition against all the centrifugal forces that pull at every coalition, whether you're in Afghanistan in 2013 or you're in France in 1944. And he's quite brilliant at that. He really does have a gift for it. It's his enduring legacy, I think, rather than as a battle captain, as the commanding general of the victorious Western Allied forces in World War II.
Well, you have the inevitable long list of complaints by Montgomery and Patton and some of the other generals about his generalship of the whole thing, the letters they wrote home and diary entries and everything like that. But in the end, he was the man in charge. The book is so vast and covers so much stuff. I picked out just a few things, and maybe you could respond to some of those things.
Sure.
During the invasion of Normandy, and we've seen, movie depictions of this. We've read books about this. There was, I guess what's called now, I don't know if it was called this in World War II, friendly fire. You pick out one place, one group of people, actually the 30th Division in the American Army, which suffered more casualties from its own Air Force, right? And there's a lot of talk in the book and a lot of discussion, and this has gone on for a long time about World War II, about the British and American attitude about bombing of German cities and the mistakes that happened with bombing of French civilians right around the beginning, in the invasion of Normandy and afterwards, and bombing even of American and British troops by their own air forces. And then further, this discussion of this kind of what a lot of people would call just almost brutal, savage attitude. One particular man named Bomber Harris, you could explain who he is, and then the American Air Force bombing these German cities. Can you talk a little bit about all this?
Well, sure. Air power, particularly in World War II, is a blunt instrument. There's nothing precise about it, particularly when you're talking about bombing with four-engine heavy bombers from 20,000 feet. There are no precision weapons at that time. And there are many mistakes that are made, including, you allude to the bombing of the 30th Infantry Division during the famous breakout from St. Lo. The Allies had been bottled up in Normandy for about 6 weeks, and there was a plan made to bomb one particular area of the front line and then plunge through with the armored forces. And there was errant bombing of a major sort. There was a 3-star Army general, Leslie J. McNair, who was killed in that friendly fire. This happened quite a lot during the war, not just in Europe but elsewhere. The question of precisely how to use air forces was debated really from the very beginning of the war almost to the very end. The British and the Americans had different points of view about how particularly the strategic air forces, the big heavy bombers, which were flying from England and from southern Italy, how they should best be used. The British believed that bombing at night and bombing cities was the most effective long-term strategy for bringing the Germans to their knees. That, in fact, if you destroyed enough German cities, German morale would buckle, and they would and invariably either rise against Hitler and the rest of the Third Reich leadership, or they would simply collapse for lack of will to keep prosecuting the war. The American attitude was, first of all, to bomb during daylight hours. They thought it was more precise that way, and not to hit cities specifically, but to look for strategic targets. And the main target, as of the spring of 1944, really to the end of the war, was the German oil production system. This did indeed prove to be the Achilles heel of the German war economy, and by the spring of 1945, the Germans were having trouble moving anything anywhere because they were short of gasoline and other petroleum products. But in the course of this rather theoretical debate, there were several million tons of bombs dropped on Germany and its satellites. And even when the Americans were trying to hit precise targets that didn't involve cities, the weather is often bad in Germany. If you're going after a petroleum plant and it's fogged in or there's heavy clouds, then you go to the alternative site, which might be a rail yard, and it might be in the middle of Cologne or it might be in the middle of Dusseldorf. And so effectively you're pounding the city just as rigorously as the British are. So, yes, there were 60 or 70 German cities that were absolutely eviscerated, Berlin among them. And it goes to the brutality of the war, the absolute totality of total war, the notion that you're taking off the gloves at this point in the war is something that just had gone by the boards. It was an existential war. The very existence of the combatants was at stake. The very existence of the Western democracies, and that was used to justify the means. And the means were about as brutal as they can get in war.
Well, I guess there was you could call it a natural misunderstanding. That's a polite way to put it. But there was also a definite point of view. The British, before this and even after the invasion of Normandy, lost over 50,000, mostly civilians, and when their own cities were bombed by the Germans. And the French, of course, were overrun, and a lot of people were killed. The Americans did not have that experience. So a lot of people are assuming that a lot of this British bombing was, even if they knew better, even if they knew it wasn't going to make any difference, or they weren't thinking about a German mentality, quote unquote, their little revenge was involved here, right?
Well, there is an element of vengeance. There's no doubt about that. And, of course, the British have suffered during the Blitz in 1940. And beginning in 1944, the Germans are launching terror weapons, the V1, which is...
Did we lose that call? Can you call him back? I guess we lost the call here. Yeah, we're talking to Rick Atkinson, and his book here is called The Guns That Last Light: The War in Western Europe, 1944 and 1945. I should point out also that this book is extraordinarily well written. He's a professional historian. Before that, he was a journalist and an editor at a newspaper. This is not an academic book. It's a silly word to use, exciting, but he writes in a very sort of exhilarating way. He's writing about all these details, and they're all correct. And he's writing about it in at great expanse, right? You'll know everything you ever wanted to know about it. And yet it's never in any way ever dull or over detailed. He manages to move it along because he knows how to write. It's good journalism and it's good writing. So this is an important thing. Have we reestablished our contact here? Yeah. Okay, we're back. Okay, I think we've reestablished communication.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm sorry. We lost each other there.
Yeah, who knows what happens? I mean, this is modern technology. So you were talking about the V1 and the V2. Then finally the Germans came up with something called a V2 rocket, right?
Yeah, the V2 was a pretty sophisticated but not very well guided ballistic missile. It traveled at Mach 6 times the speed of sound. You were utterly defenseless against it. Against the V1, which travel at about 500 miles an hour, you could actually shoot the thing down either with anti-aircraft guns or with airplanes flying defense. Against the V2, you didn't know it was coming. It was traveling so fast that there was no way to shoot it down. And there were several thousand of them that were launched at London and at Antwerp in particular. And it was absolutely terrifying to everyone who was within range of the V2. So, yes, there was an element of vengeance. Churchill, in a fit of pique on several occasions, contemplated using biological weapons in retaliation. He contemplated destroying small German cities one by one, the utterly defenseless cities, villages, really, basically to show the Germans that this was a tit-for-tat escalation of brutality. So by the time we get into the winter of 44-45, there really is very little that restrains either side. One thing that's not used by either side are chemical weapons, and there were thousands of tons of chemical weapons waiting to be used, mostly things like mustard gas, which of course had been used to awful effect in World War I, and that's the one place where restraint was showed by both sides.
So this is obviously that would had to be a decision at the very highest political levels, right? Because some generals would have used those. The policy for the Western Allies was that Eisenhower alone had authority to use chemical weapons, and Eisenhower had a no first use policy that we would not use them unless the Germans used them. Now, I found, and I write about this, the two plans that the Allies had drawn up for using chemical weapons in Normandy had the Germans use chemicals against the landing forces. One plan was predicated on caring about French civilian casualties from dumping thousands of munitions with mustard gas in them. And the other plan was we didn't care about French civilian casualties, and it would be kind of willy-nilly use of chemical weapons. So the fact that the Germans didn't use it is widely believed. It's a little ambiguous, the historical record, but widely attributed to Hitler's calculation that he had a lot more to lose than he had to gain by using chemicals, that in fact the best way to deliver chemical weapons is by air, and the Allied air superiority meant that they would have been at a real disadvantage had the war turned chemical. I think one thing people aren't familiar with is, and maybe some people are, but most people aren't, is that the Allies had propaganda bombs, literally, right?
Yes, it's true. As part of a very large propaganda warfare, kind of a subset of the larger war, there were propaganda artillery shells, shells stuffed with leaflets that encouraged German soldiers to give up, and had free passes inside. If you presented one of these things, it was supposed to get you basically a cup of coffee and a soft bed somewhere. And then there was a certain type of bomb. It was quite clever. It had a barometric device in it so that it exploded at a proper altitude for maximum dispersal of the leaflets inside. You could stuff thousands of leaflets in one of these bombs, and we would paper the continent. There were billions of leaflets dropped, all in an effort to try to, in one instance, to try to get the Germans to surrender or to be depressed about the way the war was going. In other cases, the leaflets contained instructions to slave laborers and others on how to sabotage the German war machine. So they were used for a variety of different purposes. Here's
an issue which obviously has to be brought up, and you spend some time talking about it in your book, is the black market. You talk a lot about the supplies, the tremendous amount of materiel, the billions of dollars of materiel that was brought over there. It's not just war, but war, implements of war, but then other supplies too. But you mentioned huge black market, and I'm connecting that very loosely here with you. Also go into great detail about the crimes that were committed by American and especially American forces and British forces, rape, looting, murder, etc.
Well, it's true. You have several million soldiers pushing through Europe. And war makes good soldiers do bad things, and it makes bad soldiers do horrible things. And so there were more than 12,000 courts-martial of American soldiers for major felonies. There were more than 70 American soldiers hanged for usually rape and murder. And then on a lower scale, there was an enormous black market enterprise in various places, particularly in Paris. And there were 23,000 American Army deserters, and sometimes it seemed like they were all in Paris. There were organized gangs. They would hijack trucks. Sometimes they would peddle the contents of those trucks off the tailgate. Sometimes they would peddle the entire truck. It was a real challenge for the military police and for the authorities to try and keep this under control. And among other things, it had a potentially negative impact on the fragile economy of France and especially Paris. So there was a lot of this going on, and it was primarily British and American soldiers, primarily because they had the largest contingents by far of the Western Allies.
It's impossible. We're talking with Rick Atkinson, and he's this finished and published the last in his trilogy about World War II, The Guns at Last Light, the War in Western Europe, 1944 to 1945. Impossible to cover all these points, even in a superficial way, but maybe one or two last things. You do mention, of course, in the book, huge, long discussions. And also, I mentioned earlier when we were disconnected that your style of writing is really, it's really terrific. I mean, it's impossible. It's almost impossible not to keep turning the page to see what happens, so it's a good combination of all the actual details and a very well-written history. You talk about the various battles, the Battle of the Bulge being one of the more important battles because it's something that was almost unexpected, or was unexpected. Maybe it was a failure of military intelligence, but where the Germans struck back in such force that nobody expected it. And this was at the end of December in 1944, right?
Yeah, that's right. The war had gone quite well for the Allies. At that point, the Germans had been driven from Normandy, driven across France, pushed out of the Low Countries. For the most part, they still had part of the Netherlands, and were reeling, and were back into the fatherland in Germany. And it was widely believed, from Eisenhower on down, that the Germans were on their last legs, that they lacked the wherewithal, both in terms of manpower and materiel, to mount a substantial counteroffensive. And so when it came on December 16th, 1944, basically through the Belgian and Luxembourg Ardennes, very heavily forested, difficult terrain, it caught everyone by surprise. There was very little warning of any substance. The few warning signs that had been detected either weren't taken seriously or, to use a contemporary phrase, they didn't connect the dots. Mm-hmm. And so this substantial German counteroffensive, which had been planned almost entirely by Hitler against the advice of his high command, was intended to cross the Meuse River and to drive on to Antwerp, dividing the British forces in the north from the American forces in the south, and to recapture Antwerp, which was a critical port for the Western Allies. It knocked the Americans, the attack fell almost entirely on the American forces. It knocked the Americans back about 65 miles, never quite got to the Meuse River, but very close. Mm-hmm. And it was the better part of 6 weeks before the line was completely restored. The German attack ran into difficulties right from the beginning, not least of which was it was the middle of winter. It was a very harsh winter in Europe that year. And the Germans were running out of fuel, and this hampered their armored forces in particular in trying to carry out this very ambitious attack. So it's the largest battle in American military history. 1 out of every 10 American casualties in World War II occurred during the Battle of the Bulge. It was a time of great anxiety, not to mention the tremendous casualties on both sides. Mm-hmm. Because it wasn't clear that the Germans weren't going to be able to carry out a substantial coup and to force some rethinking about how long the war was going to last and so on. So, yes, it's an extraordinarily important part of that final year of the war in Europe.
Let me skip ahead and come to the conclusion of this. And as I say, obviously, we're not even beginning to get near, beneath the surface of this book, which is an extraordinary book. Finally, near the end of the war, the Allies liberate especially, and you concentrate on the Americans a lot, the Allies liberate the concentration camps, not all of them, but some of them. And, they saw these extraordinary things. And we've already, read about this and seen things about this. But you talk you go into great detail about the summary executions that were carried out by American soldiers, like majors, lieutenants, captains, and soldiers on the ground there. They just lost it, and they executed a great many German prison camp guards. Also, during the war, a lot of German prisoners and surrendering German soldiers were just shot down dead without any kind of due process. And you mention in the book here, and this is something I made a note of here, you talk about what happened in some of these prison camps and how people were executed, 28 SS men being gunned down, etc., at Dachau. And you say one of the General Hazlip, who was an American general, I believe?
Yeah.
He said, in excusing this or explaining it, he said, he chalked it up to the unbalancing effects of the horrors and shock of Dachau on combat troops already fatigued by more than 30 days continuous action. Then you say, no doubt, yet here surely was victor's justice tinged with the sour smell of sanctimony, a reminder that honor and dishonor often traveled in trace across a battlefield, and that even a liberator could come home stained if not befouled. Quite a comment. Interesting, right? I mean, people liberated these places. They couldn't believe what they saw. They lost control. I mean, there were reasons why these wars were being fought, right?
Yes, and they're complex reasons, and the complex melange of emotions that soldiers felt, having first of all survived almost to the end, in some cases going through months and months of privation and horrors and all of the stresses that combat inflicts on soldiers, and then to come across these absolutely undescribable and unthinkable camps with thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dead or dying or emaciated prisoners. And so at a place like Dachau, there were two divisions of the United States Army that were there on the same day in late April of 1945, and there were soldiers who, just as they were liberating the place, they lost control of themselves, and SS guards had been rounded up and were then executed. And they were shot down, again, as you say, without due process. And there wasn't really there was an investigation done. The Inspector General went and looked at it very carefully and concluded that, yes, the murder had been committed here, but there was very little appetite at this point, it's the end of the war, to prosecute anybody. And it was exactly comments like General Haslip's that were used to explain away what had happened, that, look, this is the end of a very long road. And it's awful, but you got to walk a mile in their shoes to understand.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's part of the heritage of the war. As I say, war makes good soldiers do bad things and makes bad soldiers do terrible things. And what happened at Dachau and some other places is among those things.
And Eisenhower tried very hard to, at least he expressed in written and verbal form his outrage that Americans would behave this way, right?
Well, he did. He sent around, when he got wind of what had happened to Dachau, he sent around an order to all of his commanders in Europe who had court-martial authority, and it's quite eloquent. It says, look, our honor will be stained indelibly if, in fact, those of us responsible for defending America's honor don't step in to prevent these sorts of things. But it also must be added that Eisenhower was not particularly aggressive in pressing for either investigation or prosecution in these cases. But he certainly recognized the hazard that this kind of behavior caused, even in a moment of victory, triumph, and glory.
Mm-hmm. Something here, the last thing, I guess, I don't want to keep you, I know you don't have limited time, and I know you've been doing round-the-clock interviews. You were on C-SPAN last night, I think. You mentioned here that at the end of the war, there was always the inevitable letters home or diaries that people wrote about men who were in battle who said that they had never experienced life as exciting as it was then ever again in their lives, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an odd phenomenon, but if you think about it, it's not that odd. There were 16.1 million Americans in uniform in World War II. That's in a country of 130 million. And for many, it is the singular episode of their lives in terms of either excitement or commitment or sense of drama or just sense that you're doing something worthwhile, sense of camaraderie, a sense of absolute purpose and commitment, a sense of the nation being united and having the nation behind you. Mm-hmm. And then it ends. And it ends real abruptly. And I think for many of those soldiers, it was difficult to go back to ordinary life, even if they were perfectly happy to have the war over and to have survived it and to be going home to resume their civilian lives. There was a kind of hollowness and a kind of emptiness. And there were a number of soldiers who wrote articulately and movingly about the guilt they felt about missing the adrenaline and the camaraderie of those months in the war that they had spent. So, that's very much part and parcel of wrapping up the thing as you come to the end of the war. Well, soldiers having to figure out, okay, now what? Well,
so then let me ask you, for 15 years you've been fighting this war, and you finished World War II. You're victorious, so to speak, without carrying this to be extreme. I mean, for 15 years, you've been writing about this. You've been obsessed by this. You've been hip deep in it. You're ashore at Normandy. You're at the concentration camps. The war is over. Now what?
Yeah, now what? Well, I decided some time ago, Mike, that I wasn't going to go to the Pacific. That would require me to go back to the beginning of the war again, and I didn't want to do that. And 15 years, I think, is enough. So I'm moving back farther in time. Actually, I'm just beginning a trilogy on the American Revolution.
Oh, interesting.
Something of the same approach to it. Again, moving from sort of the foxhole view up to operational and strategic views. And I spent a great deal of time looking at the British and to some extent the French and the Germans as well as the Americans. So that's what I'm doing, and I'm just about to get started in earnest on it.
Okay, well, I'm looking forward to that. I mean, I've read is it called The Glorious Cause or This Glorious Cause? The Oxford,
right. Yeah. Right. That's a very fine book.
That's quite a book, but
Middlecoff.
I will look forward to reading what you write. So you're occupied. That's good. As a historian who writes this well and knows this much, I'm glad to hear you are. So, okay, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Mike.
Okay, Rick Atkinson, and the book is called The Guns at Last Light, The War in Western Europe, 1944 and 1945, Volume 3 of the Liberation Trilogy, which covers a couple of thousand pages. We are going to go to a break right now, and we'll be back afterwards. If you want to call up about anything you heard in the last couple of hours, the Civil War, and the experience of warfare, why people have to read about history, which is something I've gone on about for probably every show I've ever done. I mean, history is essential. Your own history is essential to know how it is you wound up the way you are now, and even to change it. And a country's history especially at moments like this of combat, of warfare, of why people risk their whole societies and cultures and spend all their money going to war, and hundreds of thousands and millions of people died and got wounded. Why is it that it happened? Does it have to happen again? What was it all about? How that ties into what we are now. So the number here is 866-997-4748. My name is Mike Fader. I'm on every Saturday from, what is it I'm on? 5 to 8 Eastern Time, and it would be 2 to 5 Western Time. So we'll go to a break, and we can take some calls from you after we come back. Okay, we're back. Mike Fader, Sirius XM Left 127. I would like to remind you, we do have a call here. Anybody else want to call about the concept of history? Why is it that we study history? Everything now is what happened. You go on the internet, it says 10 seconds ago. When you go on and you check onto some like news site or some update site, it says this happened 5 seconds ago, 10 seconds ago. Well, then what happens is if something happened 5 minutes ago, you consider it old news and you don't look at it, right? So news is something that's happening every second now, and it has to be reported by 1,000 news stations and websites, 10,000 websites every second. And so inevitably, what happens a minute ago, 10 minutes ago, yesterday is ancient history and nobody cares anymore. There's something about the fact that it has to be happening right now. You hear this urgency in the voices of people on the radio. This just in. And the internet is like that, too. There's alerts and all kinds of graphics and fireworks going off. This just happened this second ago. Well, if you don't study history of things like World War II or Gettysburg or what happened in the Civil War or any other kind of history, you, as our first guest said, and he was brilliant on this subject, if you don't study history, if you kill off people's ability to study history, if you steal, like the Americans did, the American Indians, language and history. If you steal language and you steal history from a group of people, you turn them into passive, docile people with no souls who are easier to manage, easier to push around because they don't have a sense of cultural identity. They don't have a sense of self that comes from something that happened before, which is why we study history. So if you want to call about that, or if you are in the service right now, or you fought in any recent wars, or if you fought in Vietnam, I'm sure you have some comparisons with your experience and what happened there. And certainly I do. And I'm going to talk about that during the 7 o'clock hour. I'm going to talk about patriotism, the flag, Independence Day, and what all that means. But maybe you have some experience with this, or you're in the service now, compared to what happened in the Civil War, how they felt, and in World War II. Some people refer to World War II as the good war. It was very clear. It was black and white. They were the bad guys. We were the good guys. It wasn't all that simple, but it was a lot clearer than it is now, obviously. So who do we have on the line? Bob from Tennessee, you're on.
Well, hello there, Mike.
Hey.
I found both the interviews very interesting. I especially thought how much I should thank you for winnowing through all the different book tours and finding the ones that I'd like to hear about.
These guys are really, obviously this man the last guy spent 15 years writing his complete history of World War II. So it's extraordinary. It's a great book to read. Extraordinary book, And
just in the interview, I was impressed with how he had a mastery of it, no matter what you asked. I was especially taken by the first interview on the Gettysburg battle. I thought that author was extremely well spoken.
I agree. He was very, very, very moving, very brilliant in the way he spoke, because he's a professor too,
Yes, well, it'd be fortunate to take a class with him, probably. I'd like to recommend another book on the Civil War. It's called A People's History of the Civil War, Struggles for the Meaning of Freedom. And it's by David Williams. He's a historian out of Valdosta State University in Valdosta, Georgia. And it's got a blurb from Howard Zinn on the cover. Howard Zinn, of course, people People's History of the United States. It says, Williams perfectly captures what we mean by people's history. His book is a startling contrast to the other literature on the Civil War. And even though this fellow had an interesting twist on the Civil War, that is to say, what were the political feelings of the different generals that were involved that influenced their maneuvers or in any way, that's something left out of many Civil War books. But most are centered on the battle and the upper tier politics. This book, A People's History of the Civil War, tells about what was the war's effect on the ordinary person, North and South, and especially in the South, where there were plebiscites, for instance, which I had never heard about, to decide upon secession. And many of the plebiscites were faked or fouled or intimidation in order to get past secession. Most people did not want secession. In fact, there were Southerners who voted in people to go up to the convention and vote against secession that then were turned around once they got up there and voted the other way. And people were very upset. There were bread riots. Women led food riots across the South because the planters who had 20 slaves or more were exempt from being drafted into the army.
Oh, that's really something. I mean, up north, the situation was that if you could pay $600, you could get out of serving, which was one of the reasons there was draft riots.
That's right. That's why the cry on both sides was rich man's war, poor man's fight.
Yeah, and what's new about that, right? I mean, you could go all the way back to ancient Rome straight up to right now, and especially Vietnam, where people were drafted. I mean, there were more people fighting and poor people fighting in Vietnam, and hardly anybody wanted to be there. So, you know what? But we mention the title of the book again, because we do have some other calls, and I should try to get to them. What's the book again?
A People's History of the Civil War, and you'll learn about the people in the South who resisted the war and fought against the Confederacy in the Deep South. So now, if Southerners would read this book, it would open eyes.
Okay, it's David Williams?
David Williams,
okay.
A People's History of the Civil War.
All right, thanks, Bob. I'm going to move on, take another call. Who do we have? Kendall. You're on, Kendall. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was really appreciating your discussion of history. Do you think with the advent of computers that it seems like it makes it so easy to find a history version that fits whatever pre-existing views somebody already has, or it'd be easy to change history so rapidly, or...
I guess that's true that... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Are you worried about technology eliminating history or changing history, or?
Yeah, I sort of am, but that's it's a discussion which is so interesting and so complicated that it's something maybe we should have a whole hour to. Maybe we could do that even next week, because I do think that there are tremendous advantages to technology and to the internet. One of the drawbacks, everything has its faults and its drawbacks. One of the drawbacks is it eliminates an interest in anything that happened more than 10 seconds ago, which makes people act in ways that aren't based on reflection and experience, which make people do stupid, trivial things. And I think it's true. Anyhow.
Oh, just a little side deal on your previous guest on World War II.
Yeah.
The reason the Americans bombed the British, and actually they bombed a lot of Polish, was the smoke. The British used yellow smoke for bombing targets, and the Americans used yellow smoke for designating targets. So the British popped yellow smoke, and the American pilots thought it was, that was the target, so that's why we bombed the British.
All right, Kendall, I'm going to move on, take some more calls. Thanks.
Okay.
Who do we have? Charles in Illinois. Yes, Charles. You're on, Charles.
Hi.
Do I know you?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Anyway, I was wanting to ask Professor Guelzo about the political aspects of the generals, and not one that was involved in Gettysburg, but General George Thomas, the Battle of Nashville. And he, in a book by Benson Bobrick, Masters of War, he discusses. I think he's almost in love with General Thompson, but so he might be biased. But he seemed like a kind of guy that wasn't involved in politics. And Bobrick brought out the thing that Grant and Sherman were undermining Thomas all the time for their own self-promotion and political aspects. And I would just wanted to ask him about that and give a plug for your book.
Oh, yeah. I have a book, too, which I will do. Go ahead. Be my guest.
The story Nomads seemed very appropriate for the conversation because of the World War II veterans that are in the book. It's a great story.
There's in this book that I've just published that I'm constantly mentioning here, called A Long Swim Upstream. It's a collection of stories I write about my life. One of them is actually about a veteran from World War II and how he's sort of set adrift and doesn't know where he's going about 10 years after World War II, and how I run into him, and how we all idolized World War II veterans. We idolized them when I was a kid in the 50s.
You still have the compass they gave you?
No, I don't. I have another one my uncle gave me from 1918 when he was a Boy Scout, but I don't have the World War II compass. I do not have it. However, I don't want to give away too much about the story. So.
Oh, yeah, I should.
Right.
You spoil the surprise. It's a great book.
All right. Thank you very much, Charles. I appreciate it. We have other calls, but I can't get to them now. If the people who are calling now will have the patience and the attention span to hang on, either you can hold on to the line if you want, or you can call back after the 7 o'clock news, and we'll pick right up where we left off. That is, we'll take your calls straight after the 7 o'clock news. But we have to take a break now for a few minutes of promos and commercials where we sell you some stuff you don't need. And then we find out on the news who blew who up and who won what tournament. So, yeah, call back afterwards, or hold on if you want to, and we'll come straight to your calls. Any music there?
And a heat advisory in New York City is expected to last through tomorrow with temperatures in the 90s. I'm Ed Donahue, AP Radio News.
Don't give me that. You gotta turn on the button if you want me to be on the radio. You keep pointing at me. I can't talk on the radio unless you turn the button on. This is a group effort here, my man. Thank you very much. I'll be here all week. I was off last week. That was a rebroadcast, and apparently, between the personnel down here, the entire crew here at the Mike Fader Show, we're having a hard time getting back in the traces. But we're back now. Yeah, I don't know. Are we? Who do we have on the line? Darnice, you're on the phone.
Oh, hi.
And you're on the radio. Go ahead.
Hey, happy Independence Day.
Well, yeah, okay, you too.
Thank you.
Happy birthday. Happy birthday to you, America. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I've got mixed feelings about all this. Only because, the document is so spectacular, the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it is just the most astounding document. It lays the basis for, our understanding about what is basic rights, basic human rights.
Why we even had a revolution, why we have a country in the first place. Right.
And I was wondering if you would do us the service of reading it.
It's interesting.
Because I have not heard it in a very, very, very long time. And if you could just, go to Wiki.
Mm-hmm. No, you know what? This is interesting.
Read it to us. And we should have some discussion about what is happening, because the parallels between what those people fought about in a very different context, I mean, it didn't include half the people in the country, right? Half the people in the country were not involved in that discussion. And we're at this point, 237 years later, 38 years later, we're at the same juncture.
Yeah.
Where half the people in the country are not participating in the conversation.
I would say, I think that's generous. I'd say it's probably around 3/4.
Well, yeah. Well, actually, this is back to the 1%.
Oh, you meant in terms of maybe even in terms of
9%.
How many people turn out to vote? It's less than 50%.
No, I don't mean that. I don't mean that. What I mean is that there are people who have interests that are not aligned with the majority of the people in the country. Who have, we've had a bloodless coup in this country.
Oh, yeah.
And the 1% have honestly taken over, and we need to look at what it took to deal with that problem a couple of 100 years ago.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, after all, when you read, I have printed out to me what is the essential part of the Declaration of Independence, and I am intending to read it tonight. But what you're suggesting is even a better idea, because it's a primer on all of American history, because some of the Declaration of Independence shows you the origins of all sorts of things, and not necessarily good things either. So
exactly.
And every year, I don't know what it's like in like other people's newspapers, but every year on July 4th, the New York Times, which is my local newspaper, prints the entire Declaration of Independence, which is a long document, in full on one full page. And I think that's a terrific suggestion. I will try to do that next week. It's a lot of reading to do, but it's a fantastic example of how you can see how we were born in this country and how some things are still perpetuated. The main example I'm going to bring out tonight is that the very core of what the Declaration of Independence was about, why we needed one, why there was a revolution, was to fight against an imperial monarch, King George, right? But now, when you read it, it's the same things that we have to fight our own government about. Why we needed a revolution then is why we need one now, but it's our own government we need it against.
Exactly.
And
it's really stunning. It's really stunning. So
yeah, that's a good suggestion.
And sometimes I don't know. I'm an oral learner. I'm so grateful for books on tape, and many years ago read for Recording for the Blind.
Oh yeah, sure.
And I have to tell you that it's just such a great way to learn. It's just such a great way to learn, and somebody reading that document with emphasis and feeling.
Well, but you said I'll tell you one problem is I'm not the best reader in the world. I'm a good talker, but off the cuff. In other words, every time I've ever tried to read anything, including things I've written, they don't come off as well. But I'll give it a shot, because I think it's a really good idea. Although it is a long document, but I think it will
take you less than 14 minutes.
You have it all timed out?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm a big
for the blind.
I'm a big audio book fan myself, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you like right now? I have 2 credits with Audible, and I cannot make up my mind.
Well, that all entirely depends on what your tastes are. I mean, what kind of books do you like?
I like science fiction fantasy, but I'm a little, everybody seems to be in the same rut right now. So I'm just not really interested in that. I think I would like to try something else, maybe a good history. But self-improvement stuff, I'm not so interested in.
No, I wouldn't be myself. Besides which, do you think you really need improvement after all this time?
I do, actually, but, where to start?
All right. Well, we have 45 minutes. That's how long a session usually lasts. But you know what? You should get in touch with me personally. I'll help you out. But self-improvement. But, as far as history books go, there's all kinds of history books I could recommend. In fact, it actually might be a good idea. Why don't you just go to my website, Fader Files?
Yes.
FEDERFILES.com. The reason I mention that is twofold. One is you can contact me that way. And if you get in touch with me, we can have a discussion about what audio books I like. And I could suggest some audiobooks because I like history and I like historical novels. And I could suggest some great stuff to you.
Indeed.
Okay, so get in touch with me.
I will do that.
All right.
I will do that. And thank you for being here this weekend.
Sure.
Doing the yeoman's work of rousing up our fellow citizens to do something about our situation.
Well,
we're going to have to hold hands and cross the street together. We're going to have to look both ways, and we're going to have to cross the street together because this cannot be accomplished individually.
Oh no, that's true. That's true. And speaking of the revolution, that's what Ben Franklin said. He said we'll have to hang together here, or we will all hang, or most assuredly, we will all hang separately.
Right.
And there it is.
We are having a real challenge here in North Carolina.
Oh yeah, sure.
I cannot recognize the state. I cannot recognize the state. And someone who is from your neck of the woods that I listen to on a regular basis, he's an astrologer, a political journalist who became an astrologer. And he thinks that what is happening right now is that they're just trying to legalize rape. And the products of rape are really not part of the woman's body. It belongs to the man. And that's where he thinks we're going right now. And to be really honest with you, I can't disagree with that.
Well,
I can't disagree with that. That is just, it's just a frightening.
That's just kind of, it's almost like a separate kind of conversation. You know what? Do get in touch with me from
I will.
And I'll recommend some of these books to you. Also, it's a good way for me to segue into, before I start talking about the subject you just brought up, which I had in mind to talk about, which is patriotism. That's what I talk about this hour, is the fact that you can learn about, and if you would be so kind as to order my new book. If you go to the website, my website right now, there's a couple of things you can do. You can get on my mailing list. You can contact me, which is something I always encourage, because if you disagree or agree, I'd like to hear from you. Also, you can learn about my new book called A Long Swim Upstream. One of the stories in the book, which I think is probably one of the best stories in the book, is about me as a kid in the 50s and my encounters with the men of my father's generation, a lot of whom were combat veterans. So there's a lot of stuff in there about war and World War II and heroism and courage and what it means to be a man and that kind of thing. So it's called
I hope that there are some stories about your uncle's garden.
There are many stories that are interesting, and my uncle also a World War II veteran. So the book is called A Long Swim Upstream. You can get it on Amazon.
No, I'm on the site right now. I'm not seeing it.
Oh, well.
You're saying that I have to go to Amazon to order the book?
You could.
I can't order it directly from you?
No, you can't. You have to go to Amazon.
So go to Amazon. Okay, I can do that.
Yeah, just go to Amazon and put.
They're an independent bookseller in my neck of the woods.
Yeah, no, they won't be in stores. You can only order it through a place like Amazon or Barnes and Noble. It's available in paperback. It's available in paperback, and it's available as an ebook on these tablets or readers, but you have to order it online. Okay?
Okay.
It's called A Long Swim Upstream. And if you do buy this book, if anybody's listening, if you buy this book and you read it and you like it, do me a favor and write me a good review on Amazon. Apparently, it helps to sell books. I'm gonna move on and get into the subject, get in touch with me.
I enjoyed it, and thanks. And I will contact you because I would like to know what you're reading.
Definitely. I'd be happy to tell you because I have some good ideas. All right, thanks.
We're listening to you. Okay, bye-bye for
now. Darnice. I was thinking about, so every 4th of July, the New York Times publishes the complete Declaration of Independence. And if you've never read the Declaration of Independence, you're listening to this show. It's a political talk show. It's a political radio show. It's a show about American history, about American current politics, about culture, about economics. All of this goes straight back to the Declaration of Independence. This show wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, First Amendment to the Constitution, I'm skipping ahead a little bit here, is about freedom of speech. One of the reasons we had a revolution in this country in which thousands and thousands of people, tens of thousands of people were killed and wounded and lost all their property, and their lives were changed for the worse for a long, long time. One of the reasons we had a bloody, awful revolution here, and one we almost lost, by the way, it took 5 years. From 1776 to 1781, it took 5 years to beat the British. They were the biggest army, the most powerful colonial force in the entire world. It took us 5 years to beat them. 5 years of tremendous suffering. And there is a book called, I think it's called The Glorious Cause or Glorious Cause, which is a book I can recommend right now if you want to read about the American Revolution. Glorious Cause or The Glorious Cause. I forget the exact title, but I read it several years ago when it first came out. And there were reasons why we fought the American Revolution. One of which is we were a colony, just like India or any other colony of Great Britain, and we had no rights whatsoever. We had some rights which were afforded to us by British common law, but essentially no rights. We were in the position of being serfs, or as close to slaves as possible in this country. We had no freedom of expression. There was no voting for our representatives, taxation without representation, you name it. We were subservient people. We had no rights whatsoever. We had the right, as I mentioned before, to certain common law British things, like if there was theft, or if there were domestic disputes, or if there were wills or contracts, we had access to some British law. But we were at the whim of any British governor in any colony, and certainly at the whim of the monarch of Great Britain, King George III, and his Parliament, which essentially went along with whatever he wanted. I mean, Parliament had tremendous debates about granting freedom to the United States of America, or certainly granting a lot of our demands that we sent over to them time and time again, which are mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, that the United States of America, especially people who had who were the heads of various colonies, Americans, not British officials, but Americans had gotten together and demanded certain things, certain basic treatment, decent treatment from the British, and it was debated in Parliament. We actually not demanded, we requested these things as humble, servants of His Majesty the King, blah, blah, blah. These things were requested. Don't do this. Don't do that. Please stop doing this. Can you give us a little more of this? They ignored everything with utter contempt. There were debates in Parliament about granting some of these freedoms and some of the rights that the Americans said that they wanted, but in the end they were all defeated in the interests of money and power and colonial acquisition and imperial dominance. And, that was fine with the king, because the Parliament in that case in the 1770s, in the 1780s, was gaining power, but it still wasn't taking precedence over the king. If the king was like our president now, and this is part of the problem. The king was like our president now. He had personal control of the army. Nobody in Parliament could supply money. Parliament could supply money or give money to the king to conduct wars, and Britain was, along with France and Spain, but basically Britain and France at that period in world history, were the main colonial powers of the world. They sent their navies and their armies all over the world, subjugated people, murdered people, raped people, stole everything they had, and installed permanent governments to keep stealing everything they had. This was the era of the beginning of massive colonialism, and America was a colony of Great Britain. So Parliament went along with it because it made them money, and it appealed to their sense of arrogance and dominance. So the Declaration of Independence, finally, after the American colonies got tired of asking and appealing through legal means for the most decent common treatment as far as taxation and common law, one thing that the Americans could not stand, and finally we did have a revolution based on this, was the fact that the British stationed military troops throughout the colonies, every place, and they were allowed to go into anybody's house. There was something called a general warrant. And this drove people crazy in this country, as it should have, right? they had something called a general warrant, which meant that the colonial governor of any place like New York or Georgia or, Connecticut could send soldiers into any house he wanted to. They could just knock on the door or kick the door in anytime they wanted without any specific warrant and say that they were going to search for contraband. They were going to seize anything in there that they thought was incriminating, and they were going to lock anybody up that they felt like just because they said they could. So we did not have access to freedom of speech, to real courts of law, to representation, to habeas corpus, none of this, right? And a lot of it had to do with money, of course. A lot of the colonists who objected, in the end, the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution was written by some of the richest people in this country. They were upset, what's new, that they had to give away a lot of their tax money and a lot of their profits were being taxed by the British without them having any say in it. So it's always about money, not just in this country, but everywhere, right? I mean, don't ever forget, really, that as idealistic and as courageous as the American Declaration of Independence is and the war for our independence, our revolution, it was steered by, captained by, organized by, and written, our original documents were written by some of the richest men in America, and also a third to a half of them were slave owners. This is something you have to remember. It's always about the money as well as other things. Anyhow, the Declaration of Independence. I was thinking the other day, especially with Darnice was mentioning to me about the Declaration of Independence, many of the things that are listed in the Declaration of Independence that Americans held, that had grief about the way King George was acting, are exactly the things that we have grief about now as intelligent American citizens who feel like we have these rights against our own government. Our own government now is a government that we would send a Declaration of Independence to if we were a colony. Our government in Washington, with the president, just like King George's military control over the entire military, it is no longer a citizen's army. It is the personal army of the President of the United States. He has a personal spy service. He has, as we all are finding out day by day, the NSA and the CIA and who knows who else. He has a personal spy service under the executive, and he has a personal army of several 100,000 or 1 million service members in various branches of the service, and he uses them as he sees fit. And he uses them all over the world, and there's serious contemplation being given to using them in the United States of America. And this is what we're dealing with now. It's closer to what we dealt with King George than any other time in American history. We've wandered that far away from why we fought a revolution. Anyhow, there's other things too. But I was wondering the other day, and I'm still thinking about it, and I've written an essay on my website. So if you want to go to Feder Files, FEDERFILES.com, there's an essay on there about patriotism and about July 4th. Patriotism, basically, let's go down linguistically. Patriotism, it comes from the Latin and the Greek root for country, essentially. Country. Let's see. The English term patriot is first used in the Elizabethan era, that's Shakespeare, via Middle French from late Latin in the 6th century, patriota, countryman, ultimately, originally from the Greek, which is patriotes, means countryman. It literally is the root of country. And then also, of course, and this is important, it's from patris, a Greek word, Patris, fatherland. Never forget that patriotism, and this is where it becomes a kind of a suspect and a problematic thing. Think of Nazi Germany, the fatherland. The origin of this is patriarchal. Patriotism, patriarchal, patrie, this is fatherland. We're not talking about motherland here. The Russians, for a long, long time, I don't know if they still do this, but even through World War II, when they talked about, when they sang their quote unquote patriotic songs, the Russians always referred to Russia as the motherland, the earth, the mother, the earth mother, right? But still, it was a patriarchal organization, a patriarchal, culture in Russia. But this idea of patriotism is originally from country, the country itself and the land itself, but also the paternalistic, the male dominance and ownership of the land. So, and here's something interesting. This is all from Wikipedia. In classical 18th century patriotism, loyalty to the state was chiefly considered to be in contrast to loyalty to the church. And it was argued that clerics should not be allowed to teach in public schools as their patrie, their country, was heaven, so that they could not inspire love of the homeland in their students if their real country was heaven. One of the most influential proponents of this notion of patriotism was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a French philosopher and writer, and he was one of the major influences on Thomas Jefferson. So the idea, and Thomas Jefferson was the major proponent, and he called it, of the division, he called it a wall between church and state. That was Thomas Jefferson's main point of view about church and state, that there should be a wall between it. In other words, that they didn't want religion involved in government. Look how far we've wandered from that. It's never been that far away, but we've wandered so far away from it that we've lost track entirely. Most of the original writers of the Declaration and signers of the Declaration of Independence, and I mean the most prominent ones, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, these people basically wrote the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. These people had little use for religion. It was important to them to make sure that people understood that religion was a separate thing, that people were free to practice, and they should be free to practice anything without any discrimination, without any government interference, free to practice in their religion as long as it didn't actually harm the physical being of the state and of individuals. They could have whatever superstitious beliefs, whatever God they felt like having, and hold their services, but that they shouldn't get one single, here, let me see if I can get a quote here. This is from, James Madison, who was, the fourth president of the United States and also one of the main authors of the Constitution. He said he was the primary architect of the entirely, it says here, secular Constitution, which is true. God is not mentioned in the United States Constitution. Something important to remember. He opposed even 3 pence of tax money being used in support of a religion. He opposed congressional chaplaincies and government days of prayer, warning that torrents of blood have been spilled over religious differences. And he absolutely did not want that for the United States of America. Anyhow, nationalism is love of country. And I'm thinking to myself, can you really love a country? Now, I love my wife. I love my kids. I love my friends. I used to love my engineer until tonight. But it's all over between us now. But I understand love between individuals, right? We all understand this. You know, you love your friends. Now, you could expand this. There are people who love, in the Civil War, Virginians fought for Virginia. They said they loved Virginia. They had a kind of a spiritual love of Virginia. What they really meant was the land itself. Throughout history and even now, and people can understand this who are in more rural situations. I live in Manhattan. There's nothing lovable about Manhattan. I can't love 104th Street and Amsterdam Avenue in Manhattan. It's just a bunch of dirty bricks and cement and asphalt. You love it? Okay, I'm glad. I'm glad you have somebody to love. But I don't, right? In fact, I detest it. That's another whole thing. But, you go to the country, or so you live in the country right now. If you live in a small town, you live out in the country. I know a lot of people listen to me all over the place in this country, right? On Sirius. And even I, who have gone on vacations, go up to Maine on vacation. I went there last week. And when I was growing up, when I was a kid, I lived in a kind of a suburb at the very edge of the city. We actually had a stream running through our community. True, until it dried up. Who knows why? But it was called Valley Stream. And, there were little, parks there. You can love a patch of earth. You can love a farm. You can love a meadow. You can love a valley you live in. You can love a mountainside. You can love earth. You can love nature. This I understand. You can love the quiet and the beauty and the serenity. If you're a farmer, you can love the earth itself. You can love a beautiful place. There are people who go, year after year after year. Even if they don't live there, they go on vacation to a certain place because they're in love with the place. You know what I'm talking about, right? But can you actually love a country? You can love people. You can love a place. You can love a moment in time. Sometimes when I've been in a good mood, which happens about once every 2 or 3 months for a few minutes, I could sit in a park on a nice spring day, and there is a light breeze in the trees, and my life is going, for me, fairly well, let's say, and I'm sitting there, but unconnected to anything else. I'm just sitting there at that moment in time, and you can hear birds singing, breeze in the trees. Somebody walks by. There's a puppy comes over, says hello to me, right? Kid walks past. I love that moment. You can love life itself in moments, I think. But can you actually love a country? Who is actually patriotic? Who is patriotic? What does it mean to love your country? I don't love my country. Now, John Glenn, do you remember John Glenn? Senator John Glenn, who I believe is no longer among us. I don't really know. He was famous because he was one of the first astronauts, or maybe he was the first astronaut. I forget now. My history is shaky here. I was 15 or 16 or 17 years old when the first astronaut went up. And this is not somebody who landed on the moon, you understand. This is somebody who was first in space, the first astronaut in space. Might have been John Glenn. Anyhow, John Glenn later became a senator. And John Glenn was a Marine pilot in World War II. He fought for his country against fascists, against tyrants. It was a clear case in World War II. We're not talking about fighting the Iraqis for oil or bribery or corruption. We're not talking about fighting in Afghanistan or this immoral war in Vietnam where we murdered people who wanted to have their own revolution because they wanted their own land and their own freedom. We, the United States of America, who were born in a revolution for our own freedom and to have our own land, we, 150 whatever years later, are over in a foreign country, just like Britain was, fighting and killing people who only wanted their own land and their own freedom, who had been tyrannized by the French as colony. You know, the French had a colony in Vietnam. It was a colony of France, basically. It was a subservient division of France, and the French treated the Vietnamese for 100, 120 years like servants, like slaves. They raped, they killed, they stole everything. There was no law whatsoever. You were protected in no way. And then you were in your own country in Vietnam. Before that was the Chinese. Then during World War II was the Japanese. The Vietnamese had been through it like nobody else in history. And then what happens after the French colonial bastards get their asses kicked by the North Vietnamese army, Ho Chi Minh? Who takes over? The United States of America. Home of the brave and land of the free. We wander 8,000 miles away or whatever it was from our own country, pick on one of the smallest countries in the world, not one of the smallest countries, but pick on a small country who are merely trying to have their own natural land for their own selves. And we become the British. We become the Romans. We become the fucking Nazis. This is how far away we wandered. And this is all the way back in the 60s. By this point, we've already wandered even further away from that. So I think to myself, John Glenn used to say, so back to John Glenn. John Glenn, who was, had a sense of love of country because he fought the fascists. He fought Hitler. He fought the fascists of Japan. He fought against them for democracy, risked his life, was, a fighter pilot ace, a Marine fighter pilot, later represents his country, going into space. John Glenn was some character, right? He was the real deal. Then he gets elected. If he's a Republican, Democrat, doesn't matter. He used to say when he saw the flag, his eyes during a 4th of July parade or something, it was a Memorial Day parade, they asked him about it. Apparently somebody saw him, they took a picture of him. He was crying on the side. He was a senator then. Tears were in his eyes. He said, every time I see the flag, my eyes tear up. I cry. I could understand that coming from him. When I was growing up in the 1950s, we idolized combat soldiers from World War II. Guys that had fought the Nazis. This was not, 1 year in, like in Vietnam, and 1 year out. This was you're in for the duration. If you got drafted or joined in 1941, December, you were in until the war was over. That's it. 2 years, 3 years, or 2, you got wounded. 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years in the Navy, the Army Air Force, the Marines, the Army, until it was over. In trenches, trench foot, frostbite, endless bombardment by, sleeping on the ground, pneumonia, wounds, and sometimes the wounds weren't enough to get you out of the combat. The most awful conditions for years on end, away from your family, away from your job, losing your mind under German bombardments, losing your mind on, rat-infested, snake-infested, bug-infested islands somewhere in the Pacific, and you didn't even know why you were there after a while, but you're fighting fascism. And the flag. Remember, when we were growing up in the 50s, that picture of the Marines planting the flag at Iwo Jima on Mount Suribachi is, and one of the most famous photographs in American history, used to, even when we were kids, used to thrill us. When I wandered around my neighborhood, and I talk about this in one of the stories in this book I wrote, when I wandered around my neighborhood when I was 11 years old in 1956, and that's where the story is set, I ran into veterans. I go in to get a haircut. The guy was a veteran. I go into the barber shop. The guy's a veteran. I go into the drugstore. The guy who was dispensing pharmaceuticals, the druggist, was an Army veteran. The guy who was waxing floors in the local stores was a veteran. Everybody was a veteran. And these guys, we looked up and they were heroes to us. They were heroes to us. And they loved America. They loved America, right? But I grew up after that, and then it was Vietnam. after I, and you ever seen the movie The 4th of July? I wasn't Born on the 4th of July. Ron Kovic, who was, disabled during Vietnam. A lot of people grew up during Vietnam, and they were urged to join the Army of Vietnam to fight the communists, our enemies. The communists were conflated with the Nazis by the people that ran America. The World War II generation, after they fought the Nazis, everybody was the Nazis to them. So they looked at the communists, and this, of course, is a lot of rich old white men in Washington, said, they're going to take away all our money and all our profits. They must be evil, because anybody doesn't want us to have, millions of dollars and lots of profits and obscene amounts of land and homes everywhere. They must be evil people. They want to take their land for themselves. They want to keep their own oil. They want to keep their own gold, their own minerals. They want to keep their own land when we could be making money off it. They must be communists. They must be evil. We have to get them before they get us. The Dulles brothers, all these people, right? So they draft everybody. And what they did was they took advantage of us. Kids like me who grew up in the 50s, and we're talking about tens of millions of boys, right, who grew up in the 50s, who believed that when America went to war, it was for good reasons, to get bad guys and fascists. They waved a flag in front of our faces. They invoked the Nazis and the Japs, and they said, the commies, the evil commies are doing it again. Who knows? Democracy is in danger, and we have to stop them now. We didn't stop the Germans at Munich, and we have to stop them before it gets started. This is the excuse to invade a country 8,000 miles away where most people are peasants who have been decimated by the French and the Japanese, and before them even the Chinese. And we go over there and kill and wound close to 1 million people. And to this day, people are still being born deformed because of Agent Orange. We drop chemicals on their country that defoliate millions of acres of growing land and jungle where people live. We, at 50,000 feet where people can't even see, more bombs are dropped on Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam than were dropped in all of World War II. We drop on these people without even knowing who we're dropping them on, blow up and murder and kill men, women, and children, tens of thousands of them. Suffice it to say, by the time we understood Vietnam, and it was the 60s, 65, 66, 67, I hated the American flag. If my eyes teared up when I saw the American flag, and I have to tell you, because of Vietnam and because of Afghanistan and Iraq and all the bad things this country does, all its imperialistic adventures, all of its murder and spying and torture and killing people for no good reason except for profit, arrogance, and power, when I see the flag of the United States of America, if my eyes tear up, it's from disgust and shame. It is not from pride. There are flags all over the place in America these days. I have never seen so many flags. We used to see flags at Memorial Day. We used to see flags over school buildings, at federal buildings. There were flags. You'd see flags. But now there's a flag every 2 feet in this country. There are 100 by 50-foot flags covering entire football fields. There are flags waved everywhere, flags flying everywhere. By the way, most of these flags are made out of polyester, and they're made in China by slave wage laborers. This is America today. All these flags that are being waved by all these quote-unquote patriots for the United States of America, who have no idea what they're talking about, who have no sense of history, are just bigoted, small-minded, arrogant, power-hungry, or serfs or followers of these people. They're waving flags everywhere. Seventh inning stretch at the football stadiums, especially. Flyovers by jets everywhere. Parades everywhere. All these uniforms, advertisements for the military everywhere. Flags, 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 flags in your face. I am sick of looking at the American flag. I don't hate my country. I don't love my country. I would like my country to be a better place. I would like it to be what it originally was. I'd like it to be what it started out to be during the Revolutionary War. I'd like it to be what it says in the Declaration of Independence. Most American flags, or more than half of American flags, I should say, are made in China by people who are being paid wages where they can barely have enough to eat and can hardly have a place to live. So American flag companies, we buy these flags in this country. We stand up, fat guys from tailgating, eating 5 pounds of barbecued meat, stand up in a football stadium where they paid $150 for a middling seat at a football game to watch people bash each other's brains in, and they had a tailgate at the side of their SUV, which is emitting choking gas all over the place and using up oil and gas so that we have a warmer planet. So it's 120 degrees in the Midwest. Fat pigs stand up at these football games, paying all this money out, right? And they put their hands over their hearts, they wave their fucking flags, and tears come to their eyes, and they talk about our brave men and women overseas defending our freedoms. Bullshit! Our brave men and women overseas may be brave, and they may be risking their lives, but it is not for American freedoms. It is in the interest of arrogance, power, and money. And people don't know it. I don't know what's wrong. There's a tremendous ignorance in America, which makes me very, very sad. I was just up in Maine last week, and in this little tiny town, there's flags everywhere. Flags on garages, flags flying from people's houses, flags everywhere, as if I made a mistake and I didn't think I was in Maine. Maybe I was in China. I know it's America. Do I have to have a flag waved in my face every second? Let me tell you something. When there are two places in history, in world history, where you saw more flags waved and more banners strung up than in any other time and place in history. One was in Imperial Rome during the Roman Empire. There were eagles and fasces, which was the original where fascism comes from, which is bundles of wheat which are entwined together, which means the people together. They had imperial eagles, flags, emblems, the Roman legions. And who in the 20th century had more flags, more square feet of flags and banners, waving them and draping them so that they were gigantic? The Nazis. When you're going to do away with common decency, with all freedom, when you want to impose the most tyrannical laws and arrogance over people, when you want to take all democracy away and all freedom and all equality, put on a good show. You got to put on a really good show. The more you put on a show, the more flags you see. Sometime, take a look at a propaganda film done by a woman named Leafy Riefenstahl, who was Hitler's favorite documentarian. And it's a movie called Triumph of the Will. It'll bore you to death. It's 3 straight hours of watching how wonderful the Nazis are in their sharp uniforms, marching in order, special troops, gigantic flags, banners, the swastika everywhere, flags, 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 flags. The more you see of square footage of flags, the more flags that are being waved, you can guarantee yourself that that's a place underneath which you will almost find no equality, freedom, and democracy anymore. The flags cover up It's like taking somebody who's rotting to death from cancer and covering them up with a nice new clean suit of clothes and saying everything looks fine here. You wave that flag, it doesn't mean we're killing people overseas all over the place for no good reason except for money, arrogance, and power and dominance. Flags in your face everywhere. I hate the sight of the American flag right now. I'm embarrassed by the American flag. I would love to look at a flag of the United States of America and feel proud of it, but I can't do that right now. It's impossible. And take a tip from me. Believe me, if you've read any history, you know this already. When you see so many flags, then it's a tip-off that you're seeing a government and a group of corporations, rich people, in league with a government. And this happened in Rome and it happened in Nazi Germany. What you're seeing is a big show put on to stimulate patriotic pride in people who don't even have a stake in it anymore. They don't even have a stake in it anymore. People don't even understand. It's easy to love America, I think. You know, who loves America? It's easy to love America if you, and it's always been this way, if you're white, if you're rich, if you're straight, right? If you're a man, it's much easier to love America than if you are black or a woman or if you're gay or you don't have any money. Not so easy to love America, if you're not in charge, if you're not somebody who is in charge of America. And here, for Denise's sake, I come across the Declaration of Independence, and let me just say about the flag, and everybody's waving the flag here. Now, a flag is just a symbol. It's either made out of cloth, most likely these days it's made out of some form of plastic in China. A flag is just a symbol. Skip the flag. Forget about the flag. And forget about all the jet flyovers and the sharp-looking uniforms and the bullshit, lying, manipulating commercials on TV. There's one for the U.S. Navy really gets me. It shows you all these brave, square-jawed men and women who are on the seas and all over the place. And it says, I don't know, I'm paraphrasing, the U.S. Navy bringing peace and security everywhere. Oh, really? Talk to people in the rest of the world about that. The important thing to concentrate on July 4th, and when you're talking about patriotism, is the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is the beating heart of the United States of America. The ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence they're not very often achieved, right? Oh, we didn't take a break? Okay, in a minute. But they are the most profound expression of why this country was formed. They really are. You got to go back to the Declaration of Independence. We're going to take a break right now. I know a lot of people are calling. I'm sorry. But we got to take a break, and I'm just going to read a little bit of the Declaration of Independence to remind us all why it is we had a revolution, what this flag really means. Okay? And we'll take a break now. Okay, we're back. Mike Fader here, Sirius XM Left 127. Yeah, I mean, like I was saying before about the flags, just check out the last couple of State of Union speeches by Obama. I'm not blaming Obama. It could be any president. Every single time you see a State of the Union message these days, or every time you see the president stand up, he is surrounded by eagles, emblems of the office of the president of the United States, and flags everywhere. The man is literally wrapped in the flag. He should be wearing a flag. This is a very bad sign. Whenever you see this, watch out. Go to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now listen, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, to secure these rights, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Does that sound like our government? To me, when I read this, the beating heart of America, it sounds like what we need is a revolution against our own government now. The spying, the spending of trillions of dollars of our tax money on immoral wars, billions of dollars to spy on us. All of our freedoms are obliterated or diluted now. Who is the tyrant? Dying for your country in a life and death struggle. I can understand that, like John Glenn, from an invading tyrant and defending your life, your country in a life and death struggle, that's patriotism. But what happens when the tyrant is your own government? In America today, like in Vietnam and the battle for civil rights, the real heroes, the real patriots now are not people who are dying in foreign wars, and I feel sorry for them. The people aren't the people in uniform, the people standing up in the Senate, and the people with the president with flags waving behind. Right now, just like in the Revolution, when they had the Declaration of Independence, in the founding of our country, the real patriots, people who got shot at the Boston Massacre, people who wrote the Declaration of Independence, people who almost died in the Revolution and risked their lives and everything. The real heroes right now in this country are people like Daniel Ellsberg and Edward Snowden. The people right now who protest tyranny and the stealing away of our freedoms, the suppression of our basic rights as people, the people who express their disagreement with this, the people who protest this, the people who put their lives and liberty on the line against our own tyrannical government, that's patriotism. Right now, that's patriotism. It's not love of land or dirt or a flag or a uniform or all this other bullshit that they pour onto you all the time. Right now, remember, the real heroes, the real patriots in the United States of America are the people who are out on the streets who are protesting our own tyranny in our own government. We have a corporate government. We have a government of the rich, by the rich, and for the rich. The people don't count anymore. If we ever needed a revolution since 1776, we need one now. Unfortunately, it's against our own government. It's illegal to take up arms against your government in the United States. It's illegal in 15 different ways, state, federal, local. You can get locked up for it. It's probably even illegal to advocate it. And I'm not advocating violence. What I'm saying is we had a revolution here once because we needed to have our freedoms. They were being stolen from us, not given to us, not granted to us. We were being treated like serfs, like peasants. We were being deprived of all of our rights to common human decency. We wanted to breathe free, to speak free, to vote, to elect our own representatives, to control our own destiny, not to have soldiers quartered in our houses, patrolling our streets. What is going on now in our country is very, very familiar if you read history. It's what the British were doing to us. It's why we had a revolution. If you want heroes, don't look at uniforms. Don't look at flags. Look at these other people, like Snowden, like Daniel Ellsberg, like Martin Luther King. People who are breaking the law now are the heroes, not the people who are upholding evil laws. I'm sorry I didn't take your calls. You want to get in touch with me, go to Fader Files, FEDERFILAS.com. I know I said I'd take calls. I apologize, I didn't. I got kind of carried away. We can resume this next week. All I can say is on July 4th, they show you these pictures of the Liberty Bell, and it's got a crack in it because they rang it so hard, on the day of the Declaration of Independence. The Liberty Bell is not just cracked these days.